Hey guys, tonight we begin a cozy journey into the quietly fascinating world of Song Dynasty scribes and their midnight ink rituals. I know, it sounds perfectly primed to lull you into a blissful doze, but there's something strangely soothing in the way scholars pounded charcoal, mixed water with glue and ash, and tuned each drop of ink by the flicker of a paper lamp. If you genuinely enjoy drifting off to the softer side of history, please like and subscribe, and share in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is on your clock. We're building a gentle, globe-spanning bedtime circle. Now, dim your lights, turn on a fan for that steady hum, and make yourself comfy. Soon we'll tiptoe into those hushed workshops, letting the hush of parchment and bamboo brushes carry you away. Now the story begins. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and focus on the tale. Soon you will drift into restful slumber. The screen now fades to darkness. Before the first blush of daylight, the world lay hushed beneath a veil of mist that curled and flowed between the towering pines. In the dim gray hush of early morning, a solitary figure moved with deliberate care, each step measured against the soft chorus of dew settling on needle and branch. The scholar, clad in a simple robe of undyed hemp, slipped from the shuttered windows of his study, leaving behind lanterns still smoldering in their iron brackets. His breath rose slender and pale in the cool air, mingling with the mist to form transient shapes that dissolved as quickly as they appeared. A fine hush fell upon the forest floor, broken only by the faint whisper of robes brushing against damp undergrowth. The scholar bent low to avoid snagging the hem of his garment upon young saplings and hidden roots. His sandals pressed lightly into the moss, the soft green cushion yielding beneath each careful footfall. Here and there, droplets of water, heavy as pearls, clung to needles and branches. As he passed, those drops fell in a gentle patter, like distant raindrops on an empty hall, while the forest's breath exhaled in cooling gusts that set the pine needles shivering in unison. The task that drew him into the pre-dawn silence was neither ceremonial nor ostentatious. He sought the blackest, finest soot, the elemental heart of ink, born from charred pine knots smoldering just beyond the forest's edge. For nights, he had paced his workshop by oil lamps, composing lines of verse that yearned for ink as deep and resonant as midnight itself. But to capture that darkness, he first had to gather the raw pigment, a process as old as ink making, passed down from scholar to scholar since the Tang court. Guided by the dim glow of a single paper lantern dangling from his belt, he reached a clearing where the ancient pines rose in solemn ranks. Their trunks, mottled with lichen and age, stood like silent sentinels beneath the shifting sky. Here lay the charred remnants of last autumn's pruning, pine knots partially burned, left to smolder beneath stones and driftwood. Each knot, once kindled by a spark of flame, had been coaxed to exude a steady plume of smoke rather than consume itself in flame. From that slow, smoldering heart emerged the jet-black soot the scholar sought. He knelt before the first cluster of knots, lantern placed carefully on a flat stone so its light would not disturb the forest's slumber. He reached for a slender iron pin, its shaft cold against his palm, and with gentle taps, he struck at the smoldering wood. Each tap released a fine cascade of ebony powder that drifted and settled upon the stone like a delicate snowfall. He worked with rhythmic patience, mindful never to disturb the glowing embers too fiercely, for a sudden gust of wind or a careless blow could ignite flames rather than coax soot. With each measured strike, the air filled with the faint scent of resin and smoke, a fragrance both ancient and solemn. The scholar paused periodically, inhaling deeply, allowing the aroma to root him in the present moment. In this mist-shrouded clearing, time seemed to stretch and slow. Dawn's arrival was a distant promise rather than an immediate truth. He moved from knot to knot, tapping and gathering, until his bamboo basket, woven with long, slender strips bound in symmetrical patterns, supported a growing depth of black powder. The basket, its weave flexible yet firm, bore the scholar's careful arrangement of soot. He lifted it with reverent hands, ensuring that the fragile collection would not spill. Beneath the basket's curved rim, he had laid a square of fine silk, dyed an unassuming gray, to cradle the powder and guard against any stray currents that might scatter it. The lantern's glow glanced off the basket's polished surface and the gleaming dark of the soot, drawing a quiet contrast that underscored the scholar's purpose. All around, the forest breathed in low murmurs, and the large boughs swayed under the weight of moisture. The scholar rose, his back straightening as he shouldered the basket. He remained in the clearing just long enough to turn his face toward the eastern horizon, where a ribbon of pale light hinted at the coming of day. Even in that faint gleam, he could sense the world awakening, birds stirring in hidden nests, insects stirring beneath leaves, and the distant promise of sun upon the mountain ridges. With each step toward home, the scholar reflected on the intangible journey that ink would carry him on later that night. The poetry he would compose relied not only on the charred pine soot he had collected but on the devotion inherent in each stage of its preparation. In the simple act of gathering raw pigment before dawn, he partook in a lineage of quiet dedication that reached back through centuries of scholarly practice. His verses would flow from the darkness he had coaxed from pine, words as clear as water and as deep as shadow. Though the workshop doors remained closed behind him, he felt already the presence of the silent stone floors and cedar counters awaiting his return. The memory of sweeping dust from floorboards, of lighting braziers to banish the chill, would follow his footsteps as surely as the remnants of pine smoke lingered on his robe. Each shard of soot collected in the basket was destined to become part of an alchemical transformation, from a fine, drifting dust to a lustrous ink cake, and finally to flowing lines of calligraphy upon pristine paper. At the edge of the forest, where the pines gave way to the scholar's courtyard path, he paused once more. The mist thinned, revealing the first slender beams of sunlight as they edged above distant hills. The air felt warmer now, though still tinged with the forest's morning cool. The scholar set down his lantern, extinguished its wick with care, and lifted his gaze to the silent doors of his ink workshop. Behind those carved panels lay the next stage of his ritual, where wood and stone awaited his gentle labor. He bent to lift the basket, its weight a promise of charcoal darkness and poetic possibility. In that moment between night and day, between the gathering of pine soot and the crafting of ink cakes, he understood fully the harmony of his work. Each breath of mist, each tap of iron upon pine, each grain of soot collected with absolute precision, these were the quiet verses that preluded his poem, the prelude to ink's transformation. And as he stepped forward to cross the threshold of workshop and world, he carried within him the hushed hush of forest shadows at dawn. The scholar paused at the threshold long enough to steady his breath and absorb the hush that clung to the workshop like dew to pine needles. In his hand he held the carved wooden latch, heavy with the night's coolness. Moonlight, filtered through latticed windows, painted pale patterns on the carved doors, dragons pursuing pearls, lotus blossoms unfurling in concert. He pressed his shoulder against the weathered panel, felt the slight shift as he lifted the latch, and then, with a gentle heave, pushed the doors inward until they creaked open on oiled bronze hinges. The sound was soft, apologetic, as if even the wood feared to disturb the lingering calm. Inside, the air was still, tinged with the faint musk of cedar and old stone. The scholar's lantern, its paper shade folded in neat pleats, lay unlit upon a low bench by the east wall. Alongside it rested brushes with bristles bound by string, bowls of porcelain destined to cradle water and eventual ink, and an array of tools he would use throughout the day. Yet before any of these could serve their purpose, the workshop itself required awakening. The scholar crouched beside a slender broom of deer hair, its handle a length of polished bamboo carved with poetic epigrams. With measured strokes he swept the stone floor in long, deliberate arcs, gathering vestiges of dust that had gathered overnight. Each sweep released the faintest echoes, and each mote of dust that lifted shone for an instant in the lantern's halo before settling again. Once the floor was clear, he shifted his attention to the cedar counters lining the southern wall. Their surfaces bore the memory of countless mornings, ink stains smoothed nearly invisible, scratches from bamboo spatulas, the indentation of inkstones pressed in earnest labor. With a soft cloth of woven hemp, he wiped along the counters, coaxing out the lingering gray film. He paused sometimes to run his fingers along the grain of the wood, as though greeting an old friend. The cedar yielded a gentle fragrance under his touch, a whisper of forest at twilight. He noticed a slight warp in one plank, the result perhaps of a season's humidity, and made a mental note to prop it more firmly before the first rains. In the corner stood the brazier, cold now to the touch. Its iron frame was simple yet elegant, rising on three arched legs from a circular basin intended to hold charcoal embers. The scholar knelt beside it and arranged a small pile of coal, horn-shaped lumps of bituminous stone heaped carefully atop slender pine kindling. He struck flint to steel, sparking a flame that caught the pine wood in an amber glow. Moments later, soft blue smoke curled upward, carrying the earthy scent of pine resin into the rafters. Once the coals glowed red within the iron basin, he coaxed them to settle and then set a glazed pot of water on the ring above, listening as the liquid hissed softly, steam rising in slender curls to fill the silent space. While the brazier warmed the workshop, the scholar moved to unroll his coarse hemp mat upon the slate floor before the low bench. This would be his station for hours to come. He laid out his inkstone, a dark slab of Duan stone, its surface polished smooth by endless rubbings, and positioned beside it a shallow dish of spring water. Near the water dish, he placed a slender bamboo spatula, its tip carved into a gentle curve, perfect for coaxing ink from a soon-to-be ground cake. Above the bench, shelves held rows of porcelain basins and bowls in delicate blues, whites, and unglazed clay, each reserved for a particular stage of ink preparation. Some bowls bore inscriptions in small, precise characters, indicating their role in measuring ratios of water to binder. Stepping back, the scholar surveyed the scene, the warmed brazier, the leveled mat, the clean counters, lanterns still unlit and windows untouched by smoke. He inhaled the mingled scents, cedar, pine, stone, and a hint of winter's chill lingering at the door. He closed his eyes briefly, recalling the dim solitude of the forest path at dawn, the gathering of raw soot under whispering boughs. Now, safe within these walls, he would transform that raw material into something ethereal, something that could give voice to moonlit introspection and starlit reverie. He unwrapped a cloth bundle from his satchel, the soot collected earlier, fine as dragon's whisker, contained in a bamboo basket lined with white silk. Emptying part of its contents into a porcelain dish, he tapped the basket gently, watching as the powder settled in a perfect mound. He traced a finger through the soot, noting its velvety texture. Even before ink and binder met, he admired this substance as if it were fine coal destined to illuminate entire realms of thought. Still, he set the soot aside for now, choosing instead to stoke the brazier slightly higher. He lifted the kettle's lid to peer inside. Water at the surface danced in tiny bubbles, ready to offer the warmth needed later to coax glue into fluid clarity. Beyond the brazier, the scholar approached a tall wooden shelf where stacked lumps of hide glue lay wrapped in oiled paper. He touched one lump thoughtfully. In time, he would boil this within the kettle's water to extract gelatinous binder, the sinew of ink's cohesion. But at this moment the slow burn of coal, the warming steam in the kettle, and the lamp oil within the central lantern were sufficient to banish the last tendrils of dawn's chill. He pressed a small iron key into the latch of a cabinet beneath the counter, releasing drawers that revealed precisely labeled jars of minerals and salts, ingredients used occasionally to refine the ink's flow or add subtle sheen for special compositions. Content that the workshop was fully awakened, the scholar paused again to lift his lantern onto an oyster shell lampstand. He pressed a slender rod to the wick of cotton bound in a smear of oil and, after inhaling once more of the cool morning air that slipped in through open windows, let flame leap and settle into a steady glow. Now the shadows receded, and every surface, peculiar chips in the stone floor, intricate carving on the door pillars, the slight warp lines in the cedar counters, became visible in the warm amber light. He straightened, smoothing wrinkles in his scholar's robe, its dyed silk panels shifting from ink blue to storm gray as he moved. Silence returned, deeper now, enriched by the hearth-like crackle of coals and the soft drip of water into the simmering kettle. The scholar closed his eyes once more, not to sleep but to feel the moment's stillness. Ahead lay hours of labor, sorting soot, washing it in spring water, drying it in sunlight that would enter through latticed windows come mid-morning, but for this brief span, he allowed himself a calm expectation. Within these walls, time measured itself in heartbeats rather than hours, in the rhythm of breaths rather than the passing of shadowed brushstrokes on the paper of a clock face. Thus, the ink workshop stood fully unlocked and awake, an intimate realm of stone, cedar, fire, and water. It awaited the scholar's hands, his patience, and his deep knowledge of centuries-old practice. Here, beneath the soft hum of coals and lantern light, raw materials would be refined, transformed, and at last rendered into the silent eloquence of midnight poetry. The day's true labor was about to begin. The scholar stood before the low worktable, where dawn's gentle light filtered through latticed windows, painting the room in muted gold. At his feet, the bamboo basket he had brought in before sunrise held the rough pine soot collected from the forest's smoldering knots. The hush of the workshop, only recently roused by the brazier's pale warmth, seemed to inhale as he approached. This hour, suspended between night's retreat and day's full awakening, was reserved for the most delicate phase of ink-making, selecting the purest soot. He knelt, fingertips brushing the woven handle of the basket. Each movement was deliberate, as though the air itself might stir the fine black dust into flight. From the recesses of his robe, he withdrew a length of white rice paper, its surface as smooth as the young moon's arc. Unfolding it with care, he laid it upon the cedar wood, aligning edges until the sheet lay perfectly flat. The color of the paper, soft ivory, would serve as a gentle backdrop against which even the tiniest impurity could stand out like a dark star. With a bamboo scoop carved long ago by a master craftsman, the scholar lifted a gentle portion of soot from the basket. The powder felt cool and slightly damp, each particle a residue of burning pine, transformed by flame into the ink's soul. He allowed the dust to drift down in a thin, even layer, letting it settle upon the paper in broad strokes. As the fine grit spread, he scrutinized its surface, here a minute sliver of wood fiber, there a heavier fragment that clung stubbornly. Each speck broke the monochrome harmony, reminding him that ink was more than pigment, it was the memory of forest fires, the echo of dawn, and the promise of a poet's voice. He paused to draw a breath, the faint scent of char and ember rising. In that moment, he recalled the forest shadows at dawn, where he had struck smoldering pine knots to release this very soot. Now, within these carved doors, the raw material lay before him, awaiting transformation. His eyes traced the black grains as though mapping islands on a river of white. One by one, he plucked away the coarsest shards with the tip of a slender jade hairpin, setting each aside in a small porcelain dish. The motion was slow and rhythmic: pick, inspect, discard. Each discarded bit carried the weight of imperfection, and each retained speck promised purity. When the paper's surface grew too thin to accommodate more judgment, he lifted it, folding it gently into quarters. The removed fragments, now neatly gathered, would later be returned to the workshop store for lower-grade ink or other uses. He brought forward a fine bamboo screen, a lattice of parallel strips, so closely woven that only the smallest particles could pass through. Resting the screen over another plain sheet of rice paper, he poured a small mound of soot across its center. The black dust glistened in the morning light, a miniature mountain awaiting its passage. He tapped the screen's edge with a knuckle. The soot began to sift through, cascade by cascade, forming a shadowy mound on the paper below. Occasionally, a coarser fragment would cling to the screen, refusing to pass. Those he lifted away and returned to the rough fragments dish. More siftings followed, a patient dance of vibration, gravity, and selection. Each tap coaxed a more uniform, velvety layer of soot to descend. He watched the fine grit collect, it seemed to breathe upon the paper, preparing itself for the next step of alchemy. The scholar's gaze shifted to the floor, where the brazier's coals glowed quietly. Its warmth pressed faintly through the stone floorboards, reminding him that the ink he crafted must be supple as living speech yet permanent as memory. Returning to the screen, he gathered the sifted soot into a neat pile. With a bamboo spatula, he carefully transferred it to a shallow porcelain basin. The basin's white glaze accentuated the soot's deepest black. He pressed the dust lightly into a low mound, as though forming the shoulders of a new constellation on a pale sky. This moment of stillness was sacred. He closed his eyes for a heartbeat, recalling the calligraphers who would later grind this very soot with water, transforming it into glossy ink that danced upon rice paper with the poet's breath. He felt a ripple of reverence, each tiny grain represented hours of labor, an unbroken lineage of scholars and artisans who had sought perfection in a single brushstroke. Opening his eyes, he reached for a long, thin implement made of reed. It served as both stirring rod and measuring stick. Gently, he coaxed the soot mound, turning it over and allowing any remaining impurities to rise to the surface. With practiced attention, he removed these last blemishes. Under his touch, the soot became as fine as dust in a still temple, each particle uniform in size and color. He noted how the light, caught by the curved basin, revealed a subtle sheen, proof of the soot's purity. When he deemed the process complete, he scraped the soot into a slender bamboo tube. The tube, polished smooth, held the finest powder for the next stage, purification by water. He marked the level on the tube's side with a delicate line, a quiet promise to maintain consistency from batch to batch. Carefully sealing it with wax and a thin strip of bamboo, he set the tube aside on a cedar shelf where other similar tubes stood in orderly rows, each labeled in his own cursive hand. The scholar rose and surveyed the workshop. Low shelves held porcelain bowls, bamboo molds, and brass balances. A soft breeze drifted in through the open window, carrying sounds of villagers stirring and distant bells from the monastery hill. Everything felt alive, work ready to continue, day unfolding like a parchment awaiting ink. But he remained rooted to this moment, aware that the day's success hinged upon the purity he had meticulously extracted. As he extinguished the brazier's last ember, his mind turned ahead, to the washing rituals, the drying in morning light, the simmering of glue, and the slow kneading of paste upon a stone slab. Each chapter of this ancient practice built upon the previous, a testament to the scholar's devotion to craft. In the next moments, he would fetch spring water from the courtyard well and return to this basin of soot. But for now, he allowed himself a quiet nod of satisfaction. The purest soot was chosen, with care, with reverence, and with an artist's devotion to the silent alchemy that would soon become ink. Dawn's earliest light has barely brushed the lattice windows when the scholar re-enters the workshop. The air within is cool, the cedar boards beneath his feet still holding the faint chill of night. At the center of the chamber, upon a low platform draped with fine hemp cloth, rests the porcelain basin, its pale glaze catching what little illumination filters through the paper screens. It is in this vessel that the raw soot, the dark soul of ink, will undergo its most delicate transformation, the ritual of purification. He settles before the basin, his silk robe whispering against the wooden floor. With a measured hand, he lifts the small bamboo scoop that holds the day's carefully chosen soot, the purest, finest bit selected just hours before under the morning's soft glow. Each fine granule had already passed through the bamboo sieve and endured his practiced eye. Now comes the ceremonial washing, an exacting process by which he will draw out every trace of ash that clung to pine's burnt remains, leaving only ink's deepest heart. He breathes in the cool sweetness of spring water drawn from his courtyard well at first light. The water, clear and laden with living minerals, stands in a wide-mouthed kettle beside him. With reverent slowness, he pours the water over the soot in the porcelain bowl. A gentle hiss rises as droplets splinter across the dark powder, and tiny ripples stir in the basin. The scholar's eyes narrow in concentration. Each motion is unhurried, poetry in the simplest of acts. The soot, once dry and dust-like, swells with dampness. He watches as fine particulates drift through the liquid, settling like distant stars collapsing to the basin's curve. Patience is his companion. He draws a slender jade skimmer from its resting place and holds it at the water's surface. With soft, deliberate sweeps, he gathers the floating impurities, white ash flecks that betray the coarser remnants of pine embers. Each fleck he retrieves is a blemish left behind by fire. With a gentle flick, he deposits them on a scrap of rice paper to inspect, ensuring that no speck remains. When the surface of the water lies still, he takes a thin porcelain ladle and, in one sinuous movement, lifts the cloudy liquid and pours it away from the basin's edge. It flows over the lip, carrying with it the faintest traces of ash, while the heavier, purest soot wafts back to the bottom. The scholar leans forward, eyes soft, and listens to the water's hush as it drains. In this quiet, he senses the beginning of creation, the latent blackness poised to become ink. He repeats the cycle. Clear water enters, silver bright, then mingles with soot in dancing swirls until the basin's floor becomes obscured. Again, he schemes the surface, plucking away any lingering impurities. Once more, he decants the tea-colored water, leaving only the darkest sediment to rest at the basin's center. Time unfurls slowly here, each repetition a stanza in a reflective poem. There is a meditation in watching soot descend, a reflection on the nature of transformation itself. How the roughest particle, once washed and settled, becomes a jewel of darkness, the very essence from which brush strokes will bloom. Outside, the courtyard stirs. A gentle breeze carries the scent of plum blossoms, and through the latticed screens the scholar can see the nap of petals drifting on stone. Yet inside, all is stillness. He lifts the basin occasionally to catch the morning light, angling the porcelain until the depths reveal a midnight blue core. When he judges the water to be wholly clear upon its final pour, he draws a soft breath and any trace of haste leaves his posture. The ritual is complete. Now comes the final, almost sacred moment. The scholar collects the wet soot into a low, flat vessel of carved teak. His fingers, nimble and warm, shape the damp grains with exquisite care. Each scoop rises from the basin like a tiny, silky star, settling in the teak dish as though coming home. He glances at his hands, blackened, yet each fleck is a promise of lines and verses yet to be drawn. The weight of centuries, of poets and calligraphers who walked this path before him, seems to settle lightly upon his shoulders. In the hush, he offers a silent bow to the silent witnesses, the pine trees in the grove, the spring water that ran underground, the porcelain bowl that bore witness to this alchemy. He positions the teak dish on a low shelf, near the window where the first true rays of sun will soon warm the soot. He knows that only after this damp mass dries gently will it be ready to meet the binder, glue rendered from hide and tendon, a marriage that awaits in tomorrow's stirring steps. For now, he allows the ritual of purification to linger in the vestibule of completion. Each minute he stands, the basin's rim catching fleeting reflections of sky and wood, reminding him that the scholar's labor is never merely a chore but a slow unfolding of art. As he steps back, the workshop feels charged with unspoken possibility. The sound of water, now stilled, seems to echo in the rafters. The porcelain basin holds a memory of motion, the teak dish cradles soot that will become ink cakes. All around, the quiet tools of his craft lie in patient readiness, the lacquered ladles, the polished stone slabs, the silk cloths that will carry the next transformations. In this moment, the scholar savors the deep calm that only comes when form and spirit align. He pauses by the open doorway, gazing at the courtyard's latticework. The world beyond is waking, birds flit among boughs and paper lanterns sway with the morning breeze. Yet the workshop remains his sanctuary, a threshold between darkness and light, between raw matter and refined art. In the days to come, the soot he has purified will nourish ink, and ink will nourish poetry. Today, he has prepared the blank canvas upon which word and brush will dance. In the gentle hush that follows, the scholar bows his head in quiet gratitude. His task for the morning is complete. Soon, the drying trays will receive the purified soot, later, the kettle will bubble with gelatinous glue, soon after, the merging of these elements will birth the ink paste itself. But at this hour, at this juncture of ritual and repose, he allows himself a moment of reflection. The purification ritual, repeated for centuries by hands like his, is more than a step in a sequence. It is a conduit to a deeper realm of craft, a testament to patience, and an ode to the stillness at the heart of creation. The scholar rises with the sun, though not to greet its full blaze. Instead, he lingers in the threshold between dawn's silvered hush and the burgeoning glow of morning. His breath drifts in silent clouds, each exhale murmuring gratitude to the night's cool air that has coaxed the soot's finest particles to settle into soft, inky sediment. The purification ritual, complete, has left behind only the purest essence of pine smoke, no trace of ash or grit, only the blackest talc, waiting now to drink in warmth and light. Light filters through the paper windows in slow ribbons, falling across the stone floor in muted lanes of ivory and amber. The air trembles with freshness, carrying the scent of distant pines and the slight tang of dew-moistened earth. With deliberate care, the scholar lifts a porcelain basin, its surface still clouded with residual droplets from the final rinse. Within it rests a delicate bed of damp soot, heavy with promise. He inclines the basin just enough to coax the excess water toward one side, where it pools briefly before he tilts further, allowing every last bead to escape. The clear water trickles away, leaving behind only the dark powder, glistening faintly as though it holds tiny stars within each mote. At a low cedar table by the window, he spreads out a length of finest silken cloth, pale as pale can be, with the faintest trace of woven pattern that shimmers when kissed by sunbeams. Over generations, silk has served as both guardian and cradle for precious elements, jade, silver, and now soot. The smooth, yielding fibers promise to draw moisture gently from the powder while preserving its velvet softness. Lifting the basin with both hands, he tilts again, guiding the moist soot onto the awaiting cloth. The granules fall in a spreading cloud, settling in a miniature landscape of tiny peaks and valleys. A few errant flecks drift beyond the cloth's edge, he gathers them at once, reclaiming them so none is lost. He stands to gather 2 wooden trays, each carved long ago from fragrant cedar and polished by decades of use. The grain, mottled and warm, seems almost to pulse beneath his fingertips. He places the cloth, now bearing its burden of damp soot, squarely upon one tray. With a practiced eye, he smooths the edges of the cloth, ensuring it lies flat, no fold or wrinkle will mar the even passage of sun and air. Then he lifts the second tray, ready for the next portion of powder. Again, he scoops slowly, almost ceremonially, guiding the soot in languid arcs, watching it form a pale ribbon of dark gray against the silk's pale field. Once both trays rest side by side, he surveys them, eyes narrowed in quiet assessment. The morning light has shifted, the sun, climbing above the courtyard's tile roofs, now sends long, slanted beams through the eaves. He adjusts the trays on a low rack of lacquered wood, turning them so each cloth sheet aligns precisely with the angle of rays. In this orientation, the light will kiss every granule, drawing out the last remnants of dampness without scorching or bleaching. A faint breeze, drawn through paper shutters left slightly ajar, drifts across the dry slab floor, stirring the trays just enough to circulate air but not to disturb the cloth. He bows his head, absorbing the tranquil tableau, the trays of soot like twin dioramas, the dust motes drifting in luminous shafts, the distant song of early sparrows. Here lies the essence of a scholar's craft, distilled to its simplest elements, earth and water, air and light, mind and hand. The slow alchemy of drying will coax the soot into a texture that, when ground and kneaded into paste, imparts that velvety resistance to brush stroke, that luminous depth of black cherished by poets and painters alike. Stillness reigns. The scholar reaches out to the first tray, his fingertips hovering above the cloth's edge. He lifts a corner, peering beneath. The soot gives ever so slightly, yielding to his gaze but not yet ready to release its final clinging moisture. Gently, he presses a pinch between thumb and forefinger, feeling for that balanced whisper of dryness and softness. At the first tray, he finds the damp just holds, a sense of slight resistance, as though the powder dreams of further light and air. He notes the morsel's weight, its nearly silent surrender of warmth to his skin, and sets it gently back. Moving to the second tray, he repeats the test, surprised to find even less moisture, the powder already approaching an ideal crumbly softness. Yet he resists the urge to gather it too soon. Each grain, still connected by capillary threads of water, needs more time to yield completely. He imagines them as tiny pilgrims returning from a long journey, pausing now in the welcoming rays, shedding their last vestiges of weariness. To fetch them prematurely would be to rob them of the final fulfillment of their purification. So he turns from them, pacing slowly to the far corner of the workshop where the brazier still glows faintly beneath a bed of glowing coals. From its embrace drifts a gentle warmth, too subtle to hasten the drying but enough to discourage any lingering chill. He knits his fingers, allowing the heat to seep through his palms, and breathes deeply of the mingled scents, cedar wood, pine soot, and the comforting smoke that hovers above the fire. All these elements are of one lineage, one continuous thread in the tapestry of his craft. Hours will pass before the trays can be disturbed once more. He will return at midday, guided by the sun's climb, to test again for perfect dryness. Until then, he retreats to his writing alcove to record the morning's labors in a small ledger bound in blue brocade. His quill, stilled by the absence of ink, waits patiently. First, there is rest from the careful movements and measured tests. Rest for both mind and body, so that when he returns to the soot, his thoughts will be clear, his hands steady, and his heart open to the next stage of creation. In the hush that follows, the workshop settles into its daily rhythms. A beam of sunlight shifts and brushes the surface of the nearest tray, setting loose a faint swirl of silvery dust that drifts like a tiny galaxy collapsing. The noise of distant voices carries through the courtyard, footsteps of servants tending gardens, the low murmur of merchants arranging their carts. Yet here, in this chamber of transformation, time unfolds at a lantern pace, unhurried and untroubled. So the scholar leans back against the cool stone wall. He closes his eyes, listening to the soft hiss of the brazier, the gentle sigh of the shutters, the distant rustling of leaves. He reflects on the journey thus far, from the pine grove at dawn's first breath, to the soot screening beside white rice paper, to the ritual washes in spring water. Each step has honed the raw, smoky matter into elemental perfection. Now, in this amberlit morning, he witnesses its final passage from damp, glistening sediment to a powder of purest matte black, destined to become ink. And as he sits, poised between purpose and repose, the scholar's thoughts drift to the steps that await, the simmering of hide glue to bind each granule into paste, the slow melding of earth and sinew, the patient kneading upon the inkstone. Yet for this moment, he allows himself to be present with the trays of drying soot, their silent promise, their fragile beauty, their endless capacity to yield beauty in strokes of brush and strokes of verse. When the hour is right, he will rise once more. But until that time, he gives thanks to the morning light, to the silk that cradles the soot, to the patient art of drying. In this space of calm attentiveness, he honors the centuries of scholars whose hands have performed the same rituals, whose hearts have known the same anticipation. And in honoring them, he prepares not only ink, but the very ground upon which his own words will one day flow. The late morning sun filtered through the eastern lattice of the workshop, casting a pale glow upon the low copper kettle that hung above the brazier. Within these quiet walls, the scholar paused at a narrow wooden shelf where bundles of dried hide and sinew lay neatly coiled in pale hemp cloth. Each strip of leathery tissue had been prepared weeks earlier, cut from tanned animal hide, then rinsed, stretched, and slowly dried until only the tough fibers remained. Now, as the scholar approached, a soft ritual began anew, the transformation of these humble remnants into the vital binding agent that would soon lend strength and luster to his ink. He selected 3 strips of hide, each about the length of his forearm and varying in width, from a narrow tendon barely a finger's breadth across to a broader swath cut from the flank. Lifting them carefully, he weighed their thickness by eye, seeking balance rather than exact measure. After all, too much glue would yield an ink too viscous and slow to flow, too little, and the mixture would be watery, the pigment unsettled. With deliberate care he draped the strips into a shallow porcelain bowl, then reached for lengths of sinew, their slender, fibrous threads promising additional gelatin and a deeper tack. Turning to the great kettle, he noted a light layer of patina on its copper sides, evidence of many such preparations. A last night's embers still glowed faintly in the brazier below. He used a small bellows to coax a gentle flame, rebuilding a soft heat that would soon coax water and hide into a slow simmer. Before adding the hide, he poured in fresh cold spring water, letting it fill 2/3 of the kettle, its clarity belied only by a few drifting fragments of charcoal from the brazier. The scholar watched the surface for a moment, pleased by the cool hue and the promise of purity. With a measured motion he drew the soaked hides from the bowl, warm, supple, and weighed down by moisture, and eased them into the water. The strands sank obligingly, curling and unfurling like dark seaweed tresses in a quiet tide. A pale mist rose as the cooler hides met the warm water, curling upward to meet the lantern's gentle glow. The scholar paused, inhaling the faint, earthy aroma of fresh spring and simmering copper, before bending to adjust the kettle's placement so the heat would be even, rising in soft eddies around its rounded belly. He prepared a narrow wooden ladle at his side, carving tools and a folded piece of rice paper within easy reach. On a small stand rested a shallow bamboo tray, ready to receive any floating scum. Time would be measured not by the ticking of brass but by the gradual changes he could see, the once clear water taking on a pale translucence, the hide softening into pale threads of silken jelly. He held the ladle poised over the kettle's rim, ready to skim the foam that would soon gather on the surface, impurities that, if left, might dull the final glue or introduce unwanted grit. Minutes passed in a hush. The scholar closed his eyes and listened to the low hiss of steam, punctuated by occasional small bubbles that rose, burst, and vanished. He recalled the dawn's collection of pine soot, the morning's warm rays drying each precious granule, and the satisfaction of having finished that meticulous task before midday. Now, in this slower phase, he felt his pulse match the rhythm of the simmering kettle, his breathing deep and even, his mind poised between anticipation and patience. A few faint scuds of pale froth drifted across the water's surface. He lifted the ladle and skimmed gently, sliding it along the edge of the kettle to gather the wisps of protein and leached fats. Each scoop yielded a milky film that he deposited upon the bamboo tray. The scum glimmered, fragile as spider's silk, before curling inward and darkening at the edges. With a practiced hand, the scholar cast each strip aside onto a scrap of cloth, revealing the now limp hides below, their surfaces rising slowly and sinking again as though breathing. He refilled the ladle and repeated the motion, his eyes fixed on the liquid as it began to cloud softly. He paused after each skim, observing how the color deepened from pale honey to a richer amber. The hides themselves softened further, strands of gelatin separating from the main strands to float like pale lacework. He refrained from stirring too vigorously, knowing that agitation might break down the fibers unevenly and introduce unwanted foam. Instead, he tilted his head, studying the patterns of the bubbles as they formed in drifting clusters. Nearby, a small basin of clear water waited should he need to rinse any utensils before their next use. The ladle, once more freed of impurities, slid back into the warm depths. Steam coiled around its handle, warming the scholar's fingers as he bent to listen. Subtle changes in the kettle's voice, a slightly deeper chorus of bubbles, told him the fats were finally yielding their last froth and the collagen had begun its slow release. He allowed the kettle to continue at this gentle boil, resolved to let time, not haste, perfect the bond that would soon unite soot and binder. While the mixture simmered, the scholar reflected on the lineage of this craft. Generations of Song dynasty literati had entrusted their most cherished verses to ink born of such patient alchemy. Poets and painters alike depended upon the clarity, flow, and endurance of these hand-prepared glues. In the hush of candlelight and lantern glow, future sons and daughters of letters would draw brushes across fine paper, the strokes guided by the very gelatin now bubbling before him. He felt connected to that unbroken lineage, as if the gentle hiss of steam carried whispers of past scholars offering silent counsel. He slid the ladle once more beneath the scum and swept it back with an even motion. Foam, thinner now and more diffuse, yielded reluctantly, like the final foam on a winter stream melting under a sliver of spring sun. Each removal refined the liquid further, clarifying it until the simmering surface appeared polished and clear. When he judged that no more scum would rise, when the kettle's reflection returned almost undisturbed, he lifted the ladle one final time, holding it aloft to examine the clarity of the captured froth. A single droplet hung from its rim, like a pearl of condensation. The scholar let it fall back into the kettle with a quiet sigh, watching the tiny ripple it made before settling. His heart, too, seemed to settle, attuned to the even hiss and the pale vapor curling above. He reached then for the hearth poker and eased back the coal bed, letting a few embers glow more brightly, just enough to maintain warmth without pressing the kettle into a boisterous boil. The hides would continue to yield their essence on this low hum of heat, and he would return moment by moment to tend the quiet surface. Within these walls, time flowed differently, measured by simmer and skim rather than by sundials or bells. Soon, in the following chapter, he would strain this golden liquid through fine silk, capturing the clear gelatin in a porcelain jar. But for now, with the hide glue nearly perfect, he allowed himself to savor the steady rhythm of the process. In the tranquil space between foam and steam, he found a stillness that prepared him for the next stage of ink making, clarifying and cooling the binder until it stood ready to unite with the purest soot and together give life to the midnight poetry that lay waiting in his heart. The small workshop was quiet now that the hide glue had finished its gentle simmer. A thin veil of steam still hovered above the copper kettle, drifting upward to gather beneath the low wooden beams, where it clung momentarily before vanishing into the cooler air of the room. Light filtered through the narrow latticed window, suffusing the space with a muted glow that fell in soft bands across the worn floorboards. The scholar moved with deliberate care, mindful of each step, so that no stray vibration might disturb the clarity he hoped to achieve in the binder. Before him stood a bamboo frame, crafted by skilled hands and draped with a fine piece of silk cloth, a mesh so delicate that it almost disappeared when held against the light. Underneath, a porcelain jar with a slender neck waited to receive the precious, translucent drips of gelatinous glue. The scholar took a humble breath, recalling the hours spent yesterday cutting dried hides into thin strips and tending the simmering kettle. Today, the task was to free the liquid from any residual impurities, tiny particles of unbroken tendon fibers, small flecks of ash from the hearth, and the faintest sediment left behind by the slow reduction of connective tissue. Gently lifting the kettle by its blackened handle, the scholar carried it to the edge of the workbench. The copper metal still radiated warmth, and a faint knot of scent, earthy, slightly sweet, rose from its surface. Resting the kettle on a smooth stone slab, he unfurled 2 lengths of silk, folding each layer upon itself until the mesh created not 2 but 3 strata, each more resilient than the last. The goal was to catch even the most minute fragments, ensuring that only pure, limpid glue would pass through. With a steady hand, he tilted the kettle and began to pour. The glue issued forth in a slow, continuous ribbon, honey-like in its thickness, glistening with a pale amber hue. At first, it pooled atop the silk, spreading outward in a perfect circle. Then, pulled by gravity, it threaded its way between the fine fibers, emerging drop by drop into the waiting jar. Each drop fell with a soft, resonant plop, as though offering a quiet promise of the ink it would someday bind to paper. As the first half of the kettle emptied, the scholar paused. He lifted the silk to inspect the viscous residue clinging to its surface. Tiny dark strands, remnants of tendon, lay trapped among the threads. Gently, he shook the cloth, coaxing them free until the mesh looked as spotless as a dewdrop on a lotus leaf. The removed particles were gathered on a small porcelain plate to be returned to the fire at a later time, so that nothing of value would be wasted. Once the kettle was wholly drained, the scholar held the silk aloft, studying its translucent folds. Shafts of morning light refracted through the liquid film, glinting like pale gold. There was beauty even in this unassuming moment, the play of light upon the surface, the spidery network of silk fibers, the patience required to achieve such simplicity. He allowed himself a brief smile, thinking of the poets who would one day lay brush to paper and rely on this very binder to carry their words. Next came the slow act of cooling. The porcelain jar, still warmed by the initial drips, was set upon a wooden stand near the window, where a faint breeze could gently stir the air. The scholar retrieved a slender bamboo spatula, its end dipped in water to prevent the glue from sticking too firmly. With measured movements, he coaxed the liquid into a spiral motion, stirring it in wide, lazy circles. The pattern was almost meditative, a private dance performed in harmony with the rhythm of his breath. Each circuit of the spatula left a subtle imprint upon the surface, an eddy that widened and then reluctantly settled back into stillness. He repeated the motion at intervals, never too often, for the binder needed to cool gradually. If it chilled too quickly, it would set prematurely, becoming brittle or cloudy. Should it remain too warm, the gelatin would become runny, a weak foundation for the soot that awaited its embrace. He found a delicate balance between the two extremes, monitoring the jar's temperature by gently cupping it in his palms. Time stretched in this silent space, and the scholar felt himself attuning to the slow passage of minutes. Outside, the courtyard's bamboo leaves rustled faintly. A stray beam of sunlight shifted as a thin cloud drifted across the sky. Inside, only the soft whisper of the stirring spatula broke the hush. Each time he paused, he closed his eyes for a heartbeat, recalling the sound of straining, the warmth of the kettle, the tranquil satisfaction of refined simplicity. As the glue cooled toward room temperature, its color transformed from golden amber to a subtler, honey-brown sheen. Tiny bubbles, once a sign of simmering life, had vanished, leaving the surface perfectly smooth. The scholar glanced at the porcelain jar. Its walls had become almost translucent, revealing the even consistency of the binder within. He tapped the jar lightly. A firm, clear note rang out, confirming that no hidden pockets of weakness remained. In this moment of completion, the scholar placed the lid upon the jar, securing it with a gentle twist. He set the bamboo spatula aside and wiped his hands on a linen cloth, mindful of not leaving any stray fibers near the precious binder. Then, with a reverent air, he carried the jar to a recessed shelf in the workshop's eastern alcove. There, among polished inkstones and finely carved brushes, the binder would rest until the next step, the carefully measured union of soot and glue. He lingered for a moment in front of the alcove, gazing at the array of tools that bore witness to centuries of scholarship. Each item, stone, brush, paper, and now this perfectly clarified binder, held the promise of creation yet to come. Already, he could imagine the scene in the late evening, a single paper lantern casting its glow across the inkstone as soot and binder were coaxed together, forming the lustrous paste that poets rely upon. The scholar folded his robes and inclined his head, offering a silent bow to the traditions he upheld. Then, with the calm satisfaction of a task well accomplished, he turned away from the alcove and prepared to gather the scales, weights, and spoons for the next chapter's precision. In the gentle hush of the workshop, the binders and inks rested in balance, awaiting the careful hand that would breathe them into life. Thus concluded the clarifying of the binder, a ritual of patience, precision, and quiet reflection. The binder, now free of all impurity, stood ready to unite with the purest soot in measured harmony. Beyond this moment lay the chapter of proportion and balance, where brass scales and ceramic weights would guide the scholar's hand. But for now, in the soft glow of afternoon, the scholar savored the stillness of completion and the promise of verses yet to be written. In the quiet light after the morning's gentle warmth has faded to a soft glow, the scholar returns to the ink workshop with measured steps. The brazier's embers have cooled to dull coals, and the cedar-scented chamber lies hushed, as though holding its breath for the careful work ahead. Today's task is one of exactitude, the weighing and recording of each component that will, by tomorrow, become supple ink cakes destined for the poet's brush. In this age of song dynasty refinement, such precision is no mere fastidiousness but the foundation of harmony, the balance between soot and binder that yields lines of profound darkness and fluid grace. He sets a narrow mat of woven rush upon the stone counter, then reaches for the brass scale. Its beam, burnished by years of handling, gleams faintly in the lamplight. Two shallow pans hang from delicate chains. One pan will hold the purified pine soot, the other, the cooled hide glue. He adjusts the pointer at the scale's fulcrum until it stands perfectly vertical, a silent testament to equilibrium. Each tiny movement of his fingertips sends a ripple through the metal, and he waits, breathing slowly, until the beam settles once more. This breathing is part of the ritual. Inhale the still air, exhale distraction, and meet the scale with a clear mind. On the shelf beside him rests a row of porcelain weights, half-gram pieces carved in miniature lotus petal shapes, a single-gram disc etched with a gnarled pine branch. He selects a single lotus petal weight, its porcelain cool beneath his palm, and places it in the left-hand pan. He then reaches for the soot, drawn from the trays where it dried under the morning sun. He transfers a small heap onto a tiny lacquer spoon, the soot's surface so finely granulated that it shimmers like powdered obsidian. With another spoon, he lifts the gleaming powder and lets it drift onto the right-hand pan, spoonful by delicate spoonful. The beam dips, then rises. The scholar adjusts, stirring the spoon's contents, adding a fraction of a grain more soot, removing a smidgen of binder here, until the beam hovers in perfect balance. Softly, he counts under his breath, 1, 2, 3, for every half-gram of soot. By centuries of practice, his fingers know the weight of a proper measure. Yet no matter how well he knows the feel, his eyes never waver from the beam's fine pointer. Balance must be witnessed, not assumed. When the soot's weight matches the porcelain weight, he lifts the pans and pours the soot into a shallow earthenware bowl. He wipes stray particles from the scale with a soft horsehair brush, attending to each crevice. Then, with the same meticulous care, he weighs the hide glue. The porcelain disc in the left pan is marked 2 grams. The glue has been gently reheated and thinned just enough to slip from the spoon like honey. He adds the binder gradually, watching for the beam's pointer to find that same delicate upright position. Once achieved, he pours the glossy glue into the bowl beside the soot, where it pools like pale amber. Between these two bowls lies a sheet of fine rice paper, waiting for the scholar's flowing brush. He lifts a slender brush, its handle of sandalwood, its bristles of weasel hair, and dips only the tip into inkstone water. With a measured hand, he writes in elegant script. Pine soot, 0.5 liang. Hide glue, 0.5 liang. Spring water, 0.1 liang. Below this he draws a small circle, bisected by a simple line, a diagram of the scale's pans, reminding future scholars how to align their materials. Each stroke of the brush is deliberate, steady, the ink flows in a deep, living black that contrasts with the pure white of the paper. Even in its brevity, the notation holds centuries of tradition, passed from master to disciple, each character a vow to precision. He pauses to reflect on the significance of these proportions. Too much binder, and the ink cakes will spread unevenly on the stone, producing brushstrokes that bleed. Too little, and the resulting paste will crack under the mold's pressure, shattering like brittle coal. The proper balance, always, is a quiet dialogue between solidity and fluidity. In that dialogue lies the secret of ink that yields both velvety darkness and the subtlest of grays, capable of rendering a distant mountain peak as vividly as a single bamboo leaf. A faint breeze stirs the roughly cut paper lantern hanging by the door, and the scholar shines his gaze beyond the workshop threshold. Outside, overhanging eaves cast patterned shadows on the courtyard floor. The distant murmur of a stream, spring water coursing over rocks, reminds him that each element in this formula springs from nature's own balance: pine soot from dawn's woods, hide glue from creatures long gone, water from hidden mountain springs. As he lowers himself to cross-legged posture, he contemplates the mirror of weights and pans before him, a microcosm of cosmic symmetry, rendered in porcelain, brass, and pigment. Once he has confirmed the ratios with his calligraphic record, he gathers the soot and binder bowls to the central mixing basin on the floor. The bowls are inverted, and their contents tumble together with the gentle sound of shifting grains and trickling liquid. The scholar rises and positions the basin over a shallow brazier, now revived with fresh coals. He will soon begin the slow stirring that unites these measured elements into a unified paste, a process that will carry him, through the coming hours, into Chapter 9's realm of warmth and motion. But for this moment, he allows himself a quiet glance at his ledger, where the formulas of ink rest in neat lines, waiting to be transformed by heat, friction, and time. With reverence he extinguishes the lantern's flame, replacing its warm glow with the amber of the brazier. And as the workshop dims to chiaroscuro shadows, the scholar stands poised at the threshold of transformation. The precise proportions he has recorded will guide the alchemy to follow, and from this silent balance will arise ink capable of transporting brush, mind, and heart beyond the confines of the wood and stone around him, into the boundless realm of poetry. Thus concludes the scholar's measured vigil, and beyond the doors, the courtyard lingers in stillness, awaiting the hushed stirrings of Chapter 9. The lantern's light wavered gently against the latticed windows of the workshop, casting soft shadows that stretched across the stone floor. Outside, cicadas chirped in the humidity of a late summer evening, their steady drone a counterpoint to the scholar's deliberate movements within. He had spent the daylight hours measuring soot and binder with the precision of a seasoned craftsman, 6 parts purified pine soot, 3 parts gelatinous hide glue, and a whisper of water to awaken the union. Now, as the sun's last glow retreated behind distant hills, he prepared to coax these discrete elements into a unified, glossy mass. The brazier stood ready beneath a shallow mixing basin of cold porcelain. Its iron legs bore the weight of that basin with quiet dignity. Gathering a handful of charcoal embers from the low flame, he arranged them carefully, forming a ring that would deliver gentle, even heat. No higher than a flicker, the fire would warm the binder just enough to lose its rigidity, without boiling it into froth. He slipped aside a silk curtain to stoke the embers, mindful to preserve the hush that filled the workshop. Each tiny spark he coaxed into brightness was a promise. Soon the hide glue and purified soot would soften, yielding the dark paste that holds inkstone legends and midnight poems alike. He lowered the basin onto the iron supports, listening as it settled into place with a faint clink. From a small tray of hammered bronze he retrieved the measured hide glue. It glimmered like pale amber in the lantern glow, its viscous form awaiting transformation. With a thin wooden spatula carved for stirring ink, he scooped a portion of glue and slipped it into the basin. At once, a soft hiss rose as warm air met the cool gelatin. Tiny bubbles formed along the edges, a delicate sign that the binder was giving way to pliability. As the glue loosened, the scholar tilted the basin slightly, guiding the molten substance toward the center. The saffron scent of warmed hide rose in gentle spirals, mingling with the sweet, earthy odor of aged bamboo in the walls. Kneading fire and protein together, he recalled the morning's ritual, straining the glue through fine silk to banish any stray flecks, and he took care now to preserve that clarity in the heated mixture. The flame's warmth suffused the porcelain, radiating through his fingertips as he held the basin steady. Now came the moment he had anticipated. He retrieved a measured spoonful of the darkest, most refined soot from its ceramic bowl. The powder gleamed like powdered jet, so fine that even a single grain seemed to float in the air for a heartbeat before settling. Gently, as one might cradle a newborn bird, he introduced the soot to the warming glue. Instantly, the particles sank into the viscous bath, dispersing in dark rivulets that contrasted with the honeyed binder beneath. For a span of time measured not by clock but by breath, he waited. The flame mutated the binder, coaxing it to accept the soot like water-absorbing ink. Steam rose in whisper-thin threads from the basin's lip, each curling tendril a testament to alchemy in motion. Then, with the bamboo spatula poised between thumb and forefinger, he began to stir. His movements were deliberate and wide, arcs drawn in the air as much as in the basin's glossy depths. The first strokes were cautious, the spatula scraped along the porcelain, lifting and folding the mixture from edge to center. Dark streaks unfurled like ribbons of twilight, tracing concentric circles that pulsed outward with each rotation. He maintained a steady rhythm, 1, 2, 3, breathing in time with the gentle scraping sound that echoed in the stillness. As the mixture warmed further, it shed its pasty stiffness. Lumps dissolved into softness, fragments of soot bonded with the glue until the entire mass darkened to an ink-like hue. He increased the breadth of his circles, widening the radius to guide heat evenly across the basin. Each revolution coaxed out tiny pockets of moisture, miniature lakes of water that pooled between folds of paste. With a slight tilt of the basin, he allowed these droplets to gather at the edge, then swept them back into the heart of the blend. The pattern repeated, a meditative dance that marked progress more surely than any ledger. Minute by minute the paste transformed. Where earlier it had clung to the spatula in stiff sheets, it now slipped away in supple folds, rippling like oil on water. The scholar paused to observe the color, a deep, luminous black, reminiscent of raven's feathers under an inkstone's sheen. He inhaled the mingled aromas of warmed hide and charred pine, each sent a memory of the forest at dawn and the simmering kettle of Chapter 6. This fragrance, he knew, would remain embedded in the ink cakes long after they dried. His mind drifted, as often it did in these quiet hours, to the poets who would one day press brush to paper, invoking that very scent in their verses. What dreams would the ink inspire? Would lines of longing and farewell emerge beneath candlelight, or paeans to the moon hanging low in summer's sky? The tactile miracle he shaped at this hearth, the union of soot and binder, was at once the scholar's handiwork and a bridge to a realm of verse. With each sweep of his spatula, he grounded that ethereal promise into tangible form. The embers began to fade, their glow receding to pale coals. The basin, once uniformly warm, showed cooler rings where heat had waned. He tilted the vessel again, this time to one side, and noticed how the paste clung to the warmer section, hinting at unevenness. Without haste, he adjusted the charcoal beneath, shifting embers to restore balance. Once the heat returned, he resumed stirring, ensuring that every drop of binder and grain of soot received equal attention. Even as the mixture thickened further, taking on the consistency of soft clay, he did not relent. 2 long dozen circles, 3 dozen, never rushing, always mindful. The spatula's edge carved faint trails in the paste, and he intentionally blurred them with deliberate turns. His hands knew just how much resistance to expect. Too gentle a stroke would fail to integrate residual pockets of glue, too vigorous a turn might introduce unwanted air bubbles. With centuries of scholarship behind him, he struck the perfect harmony between firmness and finesse. When at last he judged the paste ready, he paused. The basin's surface lay smooth and even, reflecting the lantern's glow in a lustrous sheen. No granules of soot marked the porcelain, nor any unblended folds of glue. In that moment, the scholar felt the weight of his endeavor, dozens of steps, countless hours, yet all distilled into this single vessel of midnight ambition. He palm-pressed the spatula's handle, listening to the final whisper of the fire as it surrendered its warmth. Carefully, with his practiced grip, he lifted the basin from the brazier's iron supports and set it on a low wooden stand. The heat dissipated quickly into the workshop's air, leaving the paste poised between fever and cool readiness. He offered a final glance, noting the color once more, and allowed himself a small, satisfied nod. Tomorrow, in the calm dawn, he would transfer this supple mass to the polished inkstone for kneading into cakes. But for now, he stood content with the alchemy achieved, soot, glue, and flame united at last in silky nocturnal paste, awaiting transformation into the blackest ink that would cradle poetry beneath the lantern's gentle watch. Outside, the night air held its breath. Within these walls, history and craft came together, whispering of verse still waiting to be written. The scholar extinguished a nearby candle, leaving only the soft glow of embers on the tray, and stepped back. In the hush that followed, the paste gleamed like polished obsidian, a promise forged in quiet warmth and patient stirring. The workshop doors remained open just an inch, inviting a breeze scented faintly of pine and promise. And so ended the scholar's work for the night, the first warmth behind him, the future verses yet to flow. The air in the workshop hangs quiet, warmed only by the fading glow of the brazier at one corner and the gentle morning light that filters through narrow lattice windows. On the broad cedar counter lies the iron basin from which the scholar has just drawn the thick, almost glossy mixture of soot and gelatinous binder. Each element of the day's labor has led to this moment. Now, the final transformation, when loose powder and unshaped glue become the supple, enduring paste that will bring ink's black vitality to brush and paper. He settles beside the polished stone slab, its surface as smooth as river-worn jade, and places the basin on a small wooden riser to tilt it forward. With deliberate care, he lifts the flat-edged bamboo spatula, its handle worn dark by countless hands, and, pressing against the basin's rim, begins to scrape the mass onto the center of the inkstone. The paste slides with a quiet sigh, a muted friction that seems to awaken the room. Each fragment, dense and cool, gathers on the stone like a small, dark island. For a moment, the scholar pauses to observe. The paste's color is a deep, resonant black, veiled only by the slightest sheen of moisture. He breathes in the faint, earthy aroma, hints of resin, of ash, of water warmed by the brazier, and allows his senses to settle. In this stillness, the workshop feels as if it exists beyond time, a sanctuary devoted wholly to the art of ink. He begins the kneading. With the spatula's edge pressed at an angle, he folds the outer rim of the paste toward its center. Then, using the flat of the blade, he pushes the gathered mass outward again. Fold and press, press and fold. The motions are slow, measured, each repetition a discrete step in the alchemy of transformation. The paste responds, turning supple beneath the gentle thread of the blade, shedding tiny rivulets of moisture that darken the stone's surface. As he works, the scholar's thoughts drift to the long lineage of hands that have kneaded ink in workshops such as this. Centuries of scholars, poets, and calligraphers have bowed before the same ritual. He imagines his own words flowing from brush to paper, carried by this paste, joining a vast river of verse and record. Each fold of the ink is a silent conversation with that heritage, and with his own aspirations as an artist of letters. Light shifts in the room as the sun climbs higher. Slanting rays strike the inkstone's beveled edges, glinting on minute beads of liquid that separate from the paste. He tilts the stone slightly, allowing these droplets to pool in the well that surrounds the kneading surface. Now and then, he dips the spatula into that tiny pool and returns to the paste, folding in the crystal-clear water that will provide fluidity to the final cakes. A balance must be struck: too much moisture and the paste will never solidify, too little, and it will crack when pressed into molds. Fold and press. The rhythmic scraping becomes a kind of meditation. The scholar's sleeves are rolled back, forearms showing the fine hairs that catch the light. He feels the coolness of the stone through the spatula as he presses. A single droplet of sweat gathers at his temple, woven with the faint fragrance of cedar in the workshop's air. Outside, a distant bird calls, but within this space there is only the measured cadence of blade against stone. Minutes pass, marked only by the gradual change in texture. What began as a coarse, somewhat grainy mass now takes on a velvety smoothness. He pauses, trailing the spatula across the surface. The blade lifts a thin ribbon of paste, and as it falls back, the mass settles without crack or stiffness. He nods with quiet satisfaction. The paste is ready. Yet he does not rush. Tradition demands thoroughness. The scholar collects a small amount of the paste on the spatula's tip and presses it between thumb and forefinger, gently rolling it into a tiny coil. In his mind's eye, he knows how this coil will behave. In time it will crack at impossible points, or bulge in damp spots, if any inconsistency remains. But this ribbon feels pliant, even under slight pressure. He inspects the coil for any sign of granularity. Finding none, he returns it to the main mass with care, folding it into the body of the paste. He straightens and breathes, taking in the workshop's still air. Through the lattice, a faint breeze stirs a curtain of paper. The ritual of kneading is more than mechanical, it is an act of devotion, each movement a silent prayer for clarity of expression in the strokes yet to come. The scholar recalls the poems he composed late last night by lantern light, verses half-formed until the ink yielded its voice. Now, he lays the foundation for new poems yet unwritten. Returning to the slab, he presses more vigorously, gauging the paste's response to added force. The bamboo spatula bends subtly, absorbing the scholar's intent. He lifts it higher, then lets it fall in a wide arc, sweeping the paste into a perfect mound at the center of the stone. From there, he repeats the folding motion. The paste grows shinier, its surface marked by the broom-like patterns of the blade's edges. Each fold buries the previous layer, melding them into unity. Time seems suspended until, at last, the sculpted mound holds firm. The scholar leans back and removes his hands from the spatula. The paste, now fully kneaded, sits ready to be pressed into the wooden molds that await on the adjacent shelf. He traces a fingertip along the inkstone's well, gathering the final beads of moisture, and guides them back over the mound. With a final gentle press, he smooths the ink into a low, even disc. The workshop holds its breath. Slowly, almost ceremoniously, he lifts the spatula from the stone. Tiny strands of paste cling to the blade before drifting back to the center. He places the spatula aside and wipes his hands on the sleeve of his robe, careful not to mar the surface of the stone. The paste's surface gleams dully in the shafts of light. This is the substance from which poems will spring, documents of state will be penned, letters of longing and remembrance will flow. In its density lies possibility, the capacity to capture the scholar's thought, moment by moment, on the white expanse of paper. Standing, he bows his head to the inkstone, a gesture of reverence for the craft. With measured steps, he moves toward the row of carved molds, wooden blocks inscribed with lines of classical verse. Each cavity awaits its portion of paste, ready to bear the scholar's mark. He picks up the first mold, feeling the cool grain of the wood beneath his fingers. The brief interlude of stillness yields to anticipation as he smiles, knowing that this careful kneading will shape the ink's life in the days and years ahead. Outside, the morning stir of the courtyard begins, a distant footstep, the soft scrape of bamboo sandals on flagstones. But within the workshop, all is calm. The scholar exhales, turning from the inkstone, the kneaded paste held in his mind as a promise. From this quiet moment, the next steps will unfold, molding, pressing, drying, but now, the most delicate part of the journey is complete. The ink lies ready, deep and resolute, to awaken words in the scholar's hand and to traverse the silent page with the weight of poetry. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through the narrow windows of the ink workshop, its pale rays dancing across the wooden floorboards and warming the still air. The scholar paused for a moment beside the lacquered table, inhaling the subtle fragrance of warmed hide glue mingled with the faintly smoky hint of pine soot. Every tool lay precisely arranged, the carved wooden molds, each emblazoned with flowing inscriptions of ancient verses, bowls of clean spring water, soft brushes made from deer hair, and a low stand holding the freshly kneaded ink paste. A single paper lantern, unlit, waited near the back wall, as though holding its breath until the work reached that threshold between day and night. He lifted the heaviest mold first. Its surface was smooth and cool to the touch, carved from seasoned elm that had resided in this workshop for decades, perhaps centuries. Along the base ran an elegantly incised couplet by Saussure, offering aspiration that the ink prepared here would endure as long as the enduring mountains. When the ink sustains the scholar's mind, even time becomes but a fleeting line. Around that script curled subtle motifs of swirling clouds and coiled dragons, each stroke precise, edges crisp. To use these seals was to connect directly with the continuum of poetic tradition. Every cake pressed here would carry the spirit of those who came before. A shallow ceramic bowl brimmed with clear spring water. The scholar dipped a soft horsehair brush into it and, with delicate care, ran damp bristles over every carved cavity of the mold. The gentle moisture settled into the grooves, creating an almost invisible film that would later ensure the ink release cleanly. As he worked, his mind drifted to the morning spent gathering pine soot among dew-laden needles, the patient afternoon sieving and washing the soot, and the hours invested in transforming hide and tendon into a tranquil, amber-hued binder. Each stage of the process had required equal parts vigilance and calm. Now, on the threshold of molding, his pulse slowed further, synchronized to a tempo set by centuries of practice. When the wooden mold was uniformly damp, the scholar lifted his spatula and transferred a portion of the black, pliant paste. He had already measured the precise weight, 22 drams of paste for each mold, and so sliced a wedge, careful that the cut remained clean and the mass held together without crumbling. Holding the mold in his left hand, he lowered the spatula and guided the paste into the shallow depression. It yielded as silk to his touch, conforming to the intricate carvings. He scraped the spatula gently along the rim to gather any overhanging bits, then pressed the paste down with a thumb, feeling the engraved characters fill slowly, like water filling creased parchment. As he packed the paste, he watched for any pocket of air to form. Within the cavities, near the tips of sculpted dragon claws or the thin strokes of poetic lines, small gaps could compromise the sharpness of the impression. To guard against that, he held the mold between both palms and tapped its side lightly, never too hard, 5 or 6 times. The vibrations coaxed hidden bubbles upward, releasing them with a faint pop that echoed quietly in the still room. Each time a bubble rose, he smoothed the top again, ensuring an even surface. Although these motions were subtle and modest, they carried the weight of centuries of artisans who had discovered through trial and refinement exactly how many taps were needed to produce a flawless cake. In those rich moments, the scholar felt a profound sense of continuity. He was not merely shaping ink, he was breathing life into a fragment of culture, preserving an ancient art that would one day grace the pages of midnight poetry. His thoughts settled on the seal images, phoenix feathers curling around block letters, auspicious clouds framing the name of a revered calligrapher. Some molds bore an emblem of the scholar's own lineage, its character elegantly flanked by lotus blossoms. To press ink into these hollows was almost like stamping a personal narrative into the tides of time. Once the cavities brimmed, the scholar set the mold on the wooden block at his elbow, a plinth carved from aged pine. He placed a thin, oiled silk cloth atop the mold's surface and pressed down gently with his palms, shifting pressure in concentric circles so the paste settled perfectly. The silk served two purposes: it transmitted equal force across the top, refining the shape of the cake, and protected the mold from direct contact with the paste, making extraction smoother once the ink had partially set. With each circular motion, the scholar's breathing grew slower, his mind clear, his gestures sure. At last, he lifted the cloth. The ink paste now had the form of the mold's cavity, its surface level, the edges crisp. He inspected the top, smoothing any minor ridges with a small, rounded jade rod. Tiny lines of poetry, delicate strokes less than a hair's breadth wide, stood out in relief, waiting to transfer their design to brush and paper. For a moment, he allowed himself silent admiration of the shape, jet black gloss touching the sheen of polished jade, a contrast that pleased both eye and spirit. He repeated the process with the remaining molds, moving from one block to the next. Each took on the same ritual care, brushing water into hollows, coaxing the paste into every crescent curve, tapping out air, pressing gently, and final smoothing. The workshop grew warmer as afternoon edged toward evening, shadows lengthening across the floor. Still, the scholar did not rush. He paused only to refill his brush bowl with fresh water once it grew cloudy, mindful that even the smallest detail could influence the quality of the final cakes. When all the molds were filled and smoothed, he stepped back. 12 ink cakes now sat atop their wooden blocks, an orderly half-circle that mirrored the scholar's own composed heartbeat. He took a moment to bow slightly to the assembled forms, as though greeting old friends. Each cake represented hours of labor, and behind that labor, a dedication to mastery that elevated ink-making from mere craft into a meditation on time, patience, and the enduring power of the written word. In silence, he extinguished the brazier at the room's far end. The iron pan sizzled softly as the last coals went dark. He drew a thin cotton screen across the workbench to protect the fresh cakes from airborne dust. Tonight, they would rest here under a loose cover of gauze, absorbing the cool night air until morning. By then, the edges would firm sufficiently for gentle extraction from the molds. Tomorrow, he would carry them to the courtyard, arranging them to dry in shaded racks beneath the eaves, each little cake embarking on its final transformation until it became the perfect ink for midnight verses. Before leaving the workshop, the scholar extinguished the lanterns and closed the carved doors. He pressed his palm briefly against the cool wood, offering a silent vow to return with the same devotion that had marked every stage of this creation. Down the corridor, his footsteps fell softly, echoing the restraint of his work. Behind him, the molds waited patiently, their sculpted lines ready to become black elixir cakes that would, in time, lend voice to the quiet rapture of nocturnal poetry. In that hush, the art of molding with ancient seals felt less like a mechanical step and more like a covenant between past and present, a promise that tomorrow's dawn would find a scholar poised before a blank sheet, brush in hand, ink in well, ready to capture the world's fleeting beauty in each fleeting stroke. Thus concludes the molding of ink cakes, a ceremony both simple and profound, whose ripples extend far beyond the boundaries of the wood-paneled workshop, into the silent hours where poetry awakens the heart. The midday light filtered softly through the narrow windows of the workshop, casting pale rectangles of illumination across the polished cedar counters. On one such counter, lined with the slim wooden molds freshly emptied of their ink cakes, the scholar paused to close his eyes and inhale the familiar mixture of pine soot, warm glue, and aged wood. Having pressed each cake into its mold only moments before, he now turned his attention to the quiet, exacting work of engraving personal stamps, an act that would bestow upon each cake its identity, its lineage, and its auspicious blessing. He selected the first ink cake, its surface still faintly warm from the gentle pressing of the previous hour. With deliberate care, he held the small, rectangular block between thumb and forefinger, feeling the slight spring in its texture. The edges bore the faint grain impression of the mold's interior, the top faced him now like a blank scroll. Carefully, He set it upon a low wooden stand carved with a shallow recess to cradle the block. The scholar adjusted the cake until its top lay perfectly level, neither tilting toward the floor nor inclining to the side. A single drop of water, applied with a fine bamboo brush, moistened the surface and eased the chisel's glide across the hardened paste. His tools lay arranged before him on a silken cloth, 3 slender chisels of varying widths, each forged by a village artisan and honed over years of use. The smallest, with a blade no wider than a rice grain, was reserved for the most delicate strokes, the fine lines of the name characters, the tiny dots that crowned each letter. The middle chisel, broader and flatter, would form the family seal, an emblem inherited from his grandfather, a scholar official of considerable repute under the late emperor. The largest chisel, with a gently curved edge, was destined for the auspicious symbol that he would choose to complete each impression, perhaps the sinuous curve of a cloud, a stylized crane in flight, or the squat form of a traditional coin signifying good fortune. He picked up the smallest chisel first, its handle smooth from decades of polishing by hand. Bending close, the scholar held the blade at an angle no greater than 15 degrees, so that only the very edge would shave the surface, leaving a clean, crisp line. His left hand settled gently over the top of the cake to steady it. He paused, recalling Chapter 9's swirling warmth and stirring, the gentle coaxing of soot and binder into union, Chapter 10's meditative kneading on the polished stone, Chapter 11's pressing into molded wood. Now, at this precise moment, the labor of weeks and seasons would be sealed with the imprint of his own hand. A breath, drawn deep and silent, preceded the first incision. With the chisel's edge, he carved the first character of his given name, a pair of precise strokes that flowed together like water over stone, one long, sweeping line, followed by 2 shorter, angular dashes. His hand moved slowly, each motion calibrated by years of calligraphic practice. The paste yielded beneath the blade, curling away in thin, retracting ribbons of charcoal. He paused to brush them aside with a soft horsehair whisk, each filament catching the stray fragments without disturbing the carved grooves. In the quiet air, the soft click of wood on ink paste and the faint rustle of whisked shaving seemed amplified, intimate sounds in the stillness of the room. Once the given name was complete, he switched to the middle chisel for the family seal. The characters for his lineage, assembled into a square block, required broader, more forceful strokes. He could almost hear in his mind the echo of his grandfather's voice, instructing him on the proper proportions of each stroke, the balance of negative space and form that would make the seal both legible and graceful. He pressed the chisel's face against the ink cake surface, aligning it with the faint witnesses of pencil-like guidelines he had sketched the evening before. Then, with an even tilt, he drew the blade toward him, allowing gravity and control to combine in a single, decisive movement. The fragment of paste separated in a smooth, unbroken arc, revealing below the delicate stone-gray channel of the carved line. Brushing away the residual grit, he inspected the seal from different angles. Through the arch of his brows, he noted the way light kissed the ridges of untouched paste on one side and slipped into the carved furrow on the other. A small irregularity, no more than a tiny fragment of uncut paste, caught his eye. With the finest chisel once more, he plucked it free, smoothing the edge until the groove lay true. Then he closed his eyes briefly in satisfaction and set the chisel down. For the final touch, the auspicious symbol, he studied the array of shapes he had practiced in a private sketchbook. Today, he thought, would be the emblem of the crane, that ancient symbol of longevity and scholarly virtue. The crane's slender neck and curved wing demanded curves rather than straight lines, so he retrieved the largest chisel, its gentle radius ideal for scoring arcs. Holding it at a shallower angle, he guided the blade across the paste, shaping the slender neck and wingtip with fluid, uninterrupted motion. The resonant tap of wood on paste echoed like a slow drumbeat in the small chamber, each strike deliberate, each curve an echo of ancestral form. When the crane stood complete, its form etched into the ink cake as though in relief, he laid the chisel aside and took up the horsehair brush once more. Gently, he swept away every shaving of discarded paste, even the smallest of crumbs that might mar the final impression. With a final, half-whispered invocation, "May the ink carry the heart's pure devotion," he tapped the cake lightly, listening for a clear, hollow reverberation that bespoke uniform density and readiness for drying. He repeated this ritual for each remaining cake, adjusting the angle of the chisel, carving first the personal name, then the family seal, then the chosen symbol of blessing. His body rocked slightly with each cut, as though in time to a silent meter. The slow passage of hours was lost in this intimate focus. He perceived only the soft glow of the brazier kept in a corner, the pale light from the window, and the fine shavings that fell like black snow to gather at his feet. As the final cake received its last flourish, a pair of crossed bats signifying happiness multiplied, he leaned back. Before him stood a tiered display of rectangles, each one bearing the precise imprint of hand and heart. He surveyed them in silence, noticing the subtle variations in depth, the interplay of light and shadow along the carved edges. Here, a deeper gouge that lent bolder contrast, there, a gentler curve that whispered of grace. Each cake was at once identical and wholly unique, a testament to the slow craft of the Song Dynasty scholar. At the threshold of the workshop, the wind stirred the paper screens, and a single beam of late afternoon sunlight edged across the floor. The scholar rose and, with a soft cloth, wiped the edges of each cake to remove any lingering dust. He gathered them into a shallow bamboo tray, lifting it with both hands so that the cakes lay unmoved in perfect order. In the courtyard beyond, soon to become the stage for Chapter 13's drying ritual, awaited rows of lattice racks, shaded by overhanging eaves and guarded by paper screens to shield the delicate paste from direct sun. Before carrying the tray outside, he placed a final blessing upon each cake, a silent wish for smooth, resistance-free grinding, for ink that would flow like river water when mixed upon the stone, for the lasting impression of name and symbol upon both paper and soul. Then he stepped across the threshold, ready to arrange the stamped cakes beneath the quiet canopy of bough and beam, confident that the personal marks he had so carefully engraved would endure in the verse and brushstrokes of the poets yet to come. Before the sun climbs to its zenith over the tiled roofs of the workshop, the scholar steps out into the courtyard, carrying with him the wooden racks laden with fresh ink cakes. The air here is cooler and still touched by the dawn's damp mist, and soft footprints echo against the mossy stones as he pauses beneath the overhanging eaves. Lanterns, long since extinguished, hang idle above his head, the distant twitter of sparrows greets the new day. Overhead, the carved beams of the pavilion roof cast delicate lattice shadows onto the slate paving, a quiet lattice that shimmers on the scholar's sleeves as he moves. He places the first rack upon low stone pedestals, arranging it parallel to a slender bamboo screen he has propped against a supporting pillar. Each rack holds 4 shallow trays of just molded ink cakes, their embossed soles still warm with the memory of the press. The scholar's hand lingers on the polished wood, tracing the carved inscription along its ridged frame before he slides it into position. Carefully, he tilts the lattice so that soft breeze can drift through, but direct sunlight cannot, for in the harsh glare the cakes risk cracking or fading their rich satin sheen. Leaning forward, he gently pulls a sheet of translucent rice paper screen between the eaves and the rack. He smooths its surface with the flat of his palm until it bills softly, anchored at the top by a slender cut of bamboo and weighted below by a string of small wooden beads. Through this panel, the morning light filters like pale honey, bathing the racks in a gentle glow. The scholar nods, satisfied that the screens will temper the sun's blaze while inviting the first breath of air to wander around each cake. In the stillness, the courtyard feels timeless, as if shaped by the same quiet care that formed the ink cakes themselves. With practiced movement, he turns to the second rack, carrying it into place beneath the opposite eave. Here, a young plum tree arches its slender branches, still awaiting the blooms that will follow in spring. A stray petal, gilded at its edge by the sun, flutters down to rest on the tray's rim. The scholar brushes it away with a single, measured finger, careful not to disturb the pattern pressed into the cake surface. He aligns the trays so each stands at an equal incline, a delicate angle that allows air to circulate beneath while pooling any residual moisture at the center, where it can evaporate more quickly. The courtyard, hemmed by high walls of gray brick, remains hushed. A single cluster of bamboo rustles softly at the far end, where an old caretaker tends a stone basin of water lilies. The scholar retrieves a small fan made of slender bamboo ribs and glides it lightly over the rice paper screen, coaxing a subtle movement in the leaves overhead. The shifting light plays across the cakes, revealing the fine grain of each paste, the subtle sheen of binders still settling into their final, silky state. Time passes in measured increments. Every quarter of an hour, the scholar returns to each rack. With gentle hands, he rotates the trays one notch at a time, ensuring that no side grows brittle or uneven. He listens for the slightest creak in the wood, checks for any stray fragments clinging to the ink's edges, and smooths down any minuscule ridges with the pad of his thumb. Each rotation is performed with the same reverence he would give a folding fan, an unhurried gesture that honors the centuries of tradition behind this humble substance. As the morning wanes, the scholar steps back to observe. The screens now glow softly, translucent panels of ivory through which the courtyard beyond reveals only hints of potted evergreens and the gleaming black tiles of the main hall. Underneath, the ink cakes have begun to firm, their glossy surfaces now bear the faintest matte whisper of finish. The scholar's fingertips brush the underside of one tray, feeling the steady coolness of the wood and the even distribution of weight across each cake. He breathes in the subtle aroma of pine soot mingled with the faint sweetness of rice starch, a scent he knows will linger long after the cakes pass through his hands. A soft breeze drifts upward from the east gate, carrying with it the distant clatter of a servant's water cart and the muted gong of a nearby temple bell. The scholar closes his eyes for a moment, attuning himself to these ordinary sounds of Song dynasty life. He recalls how, in the candlelit hours before dawn, he gathered the pine knots for soot, how he stirred the hide glue binder until it sang beneath his bamboo spatula, how at each stage he paused to reflect on the poems he might write when this ink at last found its way to rice paper. Now, as the courtyard sleeps in midday calm, those earlier labors converge in a slow ritual of drying, one final act of preparation before the cakes embark on their journey to brush and verse. To the scholar, the courtyard itself seems to stand witness to this transformation. Statues of carved stone lions flank the entrance to the workshop, their expressions softened by centuries of rain and wind. Above, carved rafters evoke the same rhythmic repetition as the scholar's kneading strokes, a pattern of interlocking curves grown familiar through the ages. Beneath his feet, the stones recall the footsteps of countless poets who once paused here, awaiting the perfect ink with which to capture transient thought. In this moment, the scholar feels a silent communion with those predecessors, each molded cake a quiet testament to the passing of technique and tradition. At length, the scholar gathers fresh water from the lotus basin and plies his fan again against the air, ensuring that the humidity remains balanced around the racks. He steps lightly across the courtyard, feet cushioned by moss and fallen petals, to peer behind the screens and catch a glimpse of each molded emblem. He nods in satisfaction. The seals he carved just yesterday now rest, firm and immaculate, as though they have always belonged to these cakes. In a few more hours, they will be ready for the afternoon's inspection, when every nuance of sheen and texture will be assessed by fingertip and jade rod. Until then, the scholar permits himself a rare moment of stillness. He stands beneath the eaves, one hand tucked into the wide sleeve of his robe, and gazes up at the pattern of shifting light and shadow overhead. In the quiet courtyard, time seems to dilate, the sun arcs imperceptibly across the sky, and the lattice shadows drift as slowly as dreams across the stone. Here, he thinks, is the perfect pause between craft and art, a calm interlude in which the ink cakes rest, shedding latent moisture and embracing the cool breath of the courtyard air. As he turns to leave, he traces his fingers once more over the racks, murmuring a silent blessing upon the cakes. May they dry with grace, may no crack disturb their surface, may their darkness yield the deepest hue to the scholar who summons them next. With that, he steps back into the shaded corridor of the workshop, the screens whispering behind him as they sway in the gentle breeze. The courtyard falls silent again, save for the hush of bamboo and the measured hush of drying inks, waiting patiently for the next chapter of their story. The late afternoon light slants through the open eaves of the courtyard, bathing the rows of ink cakes in a gentle, golden glow. Each cake rests upon its own slender rack, the lattice of bamboo casting subtle shadows across the matte surfaces. A quiet breeze stirs, carrying with it the mingled scents of pine smoke and drying hide glue, laced faintly with the sweetness of nearby chrysanthemums. The scholar steps forward, his robes whispering softly against the stone floor. In this hour, when the sun has begun its westward descent, the ink workshop assumes an air of contemplative stillness, neither the brisk energy of morning nor the hush of evening, but something in between, measured and deliberate. With calm precision, he reaches for the first cake. His fingertips, long accustomed to the textures of inkstone and paper, now move over the molded paste, tracing the fine relief of carved characters that commemorate the date of its creation. He feels the subtle ridges beneath his skin, the shallow grooves where ancient seals bear the poet's mark, and he notes the balance between softness and firmness. Too supple, and the cake will crumble under the brush; too hard, and it will resist dissolution when ground upon stone. Between thumb and forefinger he lifts the piece, tilting it to catch the light. A soft sheen reveals itself, neither dull nor glaring, but a deep luster akin to the surface of still water at dusk. He sets this first cake aside. While adequate, it carries the faintest hairline crack along one edge, barely perceptible but enough to signal slight unevenness in the drying process. A minor flaw, perhaps born of a sudden shift in courtyard breezes or the accidental brush of a passing sparrow. The scholar's eyes narrow with quiet deliberation. Though serviceable, this cake must remain in the general stock, reserved for the more routine studies of younger students. He passes to the next, inhaling the subtle aroma of resin and gelled binder. On this cake, his fingertips glide across the surface with uninterrupted smoothness. No fractures or pockets of desiccation mars the form. With a slow, deliberate movement, he lifts a slender jade rod, polished to a pale green radiance, and presses its rounded end gently into the center of the cake. The jade makes no mark but reveals by the slightest give of the paste that the interior has the perfect consistency, firm enough to withstand handling, yet yielding just so to promises of richly flowing ink when ground. The scholar nods, a whisper of satisfaction in his breath. Across the courtyard, the lattice trays are arranged in neat columns. Each holds a dozen cakes, awaiting his judgment. He moves down the line, his motions unhurried, intimately familiar with the shape and feel of each piece. For one cake, the jade rod reveals a tiny air pocket hidden just beneath the surface. The scholar pauses, turning the mold to examine a slight discoloration at the base, an almost imperceptible shadow where binder may have pooled. He makes a mental note: this cake will be fine for everyday correspondence or practice, but not worthy of presentation to a visiting dignitary. He marks this cake with a single, barely noticeable stroke of vermilion ink along its edge, a tranquil signifier that it belongs to the standard collection. Several trays later, he encounters a pair of exceptional cakes. Their surfaces are uniformly lustrous, a velvety black that seems to draw in the fading sunlight. He runs his fingertips over the carved inscriptions, lines of verse blessed by his own hand, and finds no roughness, no sign of incomplete adhesion. Bringing the jade rod to bear, he presses with measured firmness. The paste yields in perfect harmony, neither too rigid nor too soft. In his mind, the scholar recalls how many weeks of labor have culminated in this moment. The morning collections of pine soot, the slow washings and sun-drying, the precise heating of hide glue, the long kneading upon the inkstone, the shaping within carved molds, the careful turnings on bamboo racks through early hours, all these steps have led to the creation of these two select cakes. He pauses before marking them. Instead, he lifts one to study its weight. The heft speaks of balanced moisture, a promise that when ground, the ink will flow like molten night, dense with pigment yet free of grit. He breathes in deeply, savoring the faint tang of animal glue mingled with the resinous memory of pine. These cakes are destined for special use, poetic commissions, rare letters to esteemed colleagues, or the scholar's own late-night verses. With a tiny goosefeather brush he dips into a small pot of cinnabar, then strokes two fine characters on each cake's rim, the characters for Spring Moon, an auspicious name he has given to this batch in honor of the coming season. The red threads stand out vividly against the deep black, a seal of his highest approval. The breeze shifts once more, stirring the scholar's hair. He steps back, raising his gaze to the sky where clouds drift lazily westward. In the courtyard below, the racks hold cakes of varied quality, each tagged with ink strokes or left unmarked, awaiting the next stage, wrapping. He surveys the scene as though it were a field of carefully tended crops. Some fruits have ripened to perfection, others remain to swell and mature. Later, under the careful hands of silk wrappers, those prime cakes will be swathed in fine cloth and sent forth to scholars and poets who prize the purity of their ink. Yet for now, the scholar lingers in this half-lit tranquility, cherishing the tactile communion of hand and paste. He moves along one final row, mindful of cracks that hide beneath the glow of fading sun. There, at the edge of the last tray, he discovers a small flaw, an almost minute indentation where the mold did not fill entirely. Unperturbed, he places the cake on a low bench and, with the jade rod, smooths the surface, pressing gently until the depression disappears. It is a subtle repair, a final act of guardianship over the fragile fruits of labor. He lays the rod back on the bench, careful to position it beside the small pot of vermilion and the goosefeather brush. At length, the scholar straightens. The courtyard feels cooler now, the golden light dimming to a soft amber. Each marked cake stands ready for its destined use, the vermilion strokes denoting common, the cinnabar seal of spring moon, reserving the finest for special occasions. He breathes in the tranquility one last time, mindful that tomorrow will bring new tasks, silk wrapping, weighing bamboo ribbons, and perhaps the arrival of a visiting poet. But this afternoon, in this quiet verdict over molded paste, the heart of the ink workshop has revealed itself once more, a slow, exacting craft where every crease smoothed and every sheen assessed binds scholar, tradition, and the written word in seamless harmony. The late afternoon sun softened as it slanted through the workshop's latticed windows, casting a honeyed glow upon the wooden floorboards. In the quiet hush that followed the afternoon inspection, the scholar paused at a low cedar table, surveying the rows of ink cakes that gleamed like midnight moons. Each cake, once humble soot and hide glue, now stood firm and smooth in its molded form, bearing the faint imprint of carved motifs and personal seals. The final act remained, to swathe these small treasures in silk and bind them with bamboo, a gesture both practical and poetic, for the wrapping itself would speak of care and tradition. First, the scholar turned to the chest of silk set against the eastern wall. The doors, carved with cloud patterns, were swung open with a soft creak. Inside lay bolts of cloth in muted autumnal hues, pale gold, moss green, tea brown. Yet at the top, folded neatly upon a tray of sandalwood, lay lengths of deep indigo silk. The dye was derived from the leaves of the woad plant, fermented and bathed in iron-rich water until its tone deepened to the color of twilight just after sunset. These swaths of fabric, cool and whisper-thin, were prized for their ability to protect the ink cakes from stray light and dampness. They were also an offering of reverence. Each cake, wrapped in indigo silk, became more than a tool, it became a small vessel of art. The scholar's fingers brushed across the cloth. It felt like the smooth underside of a river stone, and the faint aroma of fermented leaves rose in a delicate perfume. Gently, each length was lifted and carried to the workspace near the braided bamboo rack. There, a wooden board had been polished with camellia oil to a soft sheen, ready to receive the silk and its precious contents. The scholar breathed in slowly, letting the rhythm of the heart match the steady flow of afternoon light. One by one, the ink cakes were brought forward on a shallow wooden tray, 6 in total, each stamped with a line of verse and the scholar's personal seal. The scholar placed the tray to one side and retrieved a single cake, holding it carefully between thumb and forefinger. The surface was cool to the touch, its hardness reminiscent of a river pebble worn smooth by centuries of water. Sliding the cake onto the center of a square of indigo silk, the scholar measured the sides in his mind's eye, recalling the precise proportions that would ensure the cloth folded evenly, edge to edge. With quiet deliberation, the scholar lifted one corner of the silk and drew it halfway across the cake. The motion was slow, as though drawing a curtain against a window at dusk. The sound was a faint susurrus, like wind through bamboo leaves. Then the scholar folded the opposite corner so that the 2 points met, creating a diagonal wrap that encased the cake. Next, the remaining two corners were brought in turn, each fold slipping easily into place, the cloth hugging the cake's edges as though it were being cradled. The final overlap was tucked neatly beneath, and the scholar's fingers smoothed the surface, coaxing out any stray creases until the wrapped form sat perfect and plump. A moment passed in silence. The scholar paused, listening to the creak of floorboards underfoot and the distant song of a passing sparrow. Then he reached for a bundle of slender bamboo strips, each no wider than a fine hairpin and as light as a dragonfly's wing. These strips had been cut from young bamboo, steamed to retain slight flexibility, and left to dry in the shade until they reached just enough resilience to hold form without snapping. Each was polished with rice bran to avoid splintering. He selected 3 pieces and held them between thumb and forefinger. With one smooth motion, he looped the first around the middle of the wrapped cake, crossing the ends beneath and cinching gently. The bamboo made a soft click as it found purchase, ensuring the cloth would remain snug. The second strip was applied lengthwise, binding the cake from top to bottom, and the third encircled it once more, this time at a slight angle, forming a neat lattice of support. Each tie was tied off with a small knot that lay flush against the silk, so that no loose ends would catch or fray. As the scholar worked, his mind wandered to the long line of literary ancestors who had tended ink in this manner. He thought of Wang Shiji, who is said to have prized a single fine stick more than a mountain of mediocre sticks, and of the reclusive poets who wandered into forest temples to perfect their calligraphy. In each ink cake lay not only soot and glue, but also the devotion of countless scholars, an unbroken chain of hands that gathered, purified, bound, and preserved. By the time the scholar finished, the room was suffused with a gentle amber light. 5 more cakes waited in silence. One by one, he wrapped and tied them, moving with the slow certainty of a man intent on making each gesture matter. The bamboo ribbons curved like small crescents around the silk bundles, lending them the appearance of dark moons ready to be carried off into the night. When the final knot was tied, the scholar placed each package upon a low cedar rack, aligning them as one would seeds in a row, prepared for planting. He stepped back and surveyed his work, 6 small parcels, identical yet distinct, each wrapped with care and bound as though harboring a secret. The deep indigo cloth held the promise of midnight verses yet unwritten, the bamboo ribbon spoke of hope and patience, the cakes inside were steadfast companions to brushes and stones and wells of spring water. A single lantern was lit, and its light played across the silk in gentle waves. In that moment, the scholar felt a quiet satisfaction, as though the day's labor had been distilled into these simple bundles. He understood that wrapping the ink cakes was not merely the final step in a long process, but a ritual in itself, a closing of the circle that began in the pine forest at dawn and would end in the flicker of candlelight at midnight. And so, with the silk wraps tied and the bamboo ribbon secured, chapter 15 found its calm conclusion. The ink cakes lay ready for the next chapter of their journey, a journey that would bring them, in time, to the touch of brushes, the caress of rice paper, and the birth of poems beneath the hush of night. As the scholar prepared to close the workshop's doors, he paused, briefly, to imagine the words these little cakes would help shape, illuminated by lantern glow and guided by the steady mind of a poet. Then he turned the key in the latch, and with the hush of bamboo husks in the evening breeze, the workshop settled into silence once more. Thus, in the quiet that followed, the stage was set for what would come, a visitor's deliberation, the grinding of ink beneath lantern light, and the composing of midnight verses that would rise from these wrapped cakes to greet the moon. Chapter 15 closed gently, leaving only the faint memory of silk rustle and bamboo's whisper, and the promise of poems waiting to be born. The late afternoon sun had begun its slow descent behind the tiled rooftops when the visiting poet arrived at the scholar's workshop. A hush lay over the courtyard, broken only by the soft ripple of wind through paper lanterns and the faint creak of bamboo screens swaying in their wooden frames. The scholar stood near the low stone altar, where the newly wrapped ink cakes had been arranged in neat rows upon a polished cedar table. Each bundle, cloaked in deep indigo silk and bound by slender bamboo ribbons, gave off a muted gleam that hinted at hidden depths within. The poet paused at the threshold, inhaling the mingled aroma of animal glue, soot, and the faint tang of cedar, as though the air itself had been steeped in centuries of careful craft. Gently, the scholar lifted the first package from its place. The silk loosened beneath his fingers, yielding to the ribbon's release with a faint rustle. "Observe its weight," he murmured in a voice as soft as paper brushing stone. The poet accepted the bundle, turning it over in his hands. The bamboo ties felt cool yet springy. The silk, once unfurled, revealed a square of midnight blue cloth that wrapped the ink cake like a folded petal. He brought it to his chest, testing the substance's heft. He listened to its silence, as though the ink held within might speak if coaxed. Under his palm, the cloth's folds left barely perceptible impressions, as if the cake inside were already stirring to life. One by one, the scholar presented each bundle for the poet's consideration. Each was similar at first glance, yet each bore its own secret cadence, some slightly heavier, others more yielding when pressed. Their aromas varied, a hint of sweet resin from the pine soot gathered at dawn, a subtle tang of simmered hide glue, even traces of bamboo smoke from the workshop's brazier. The poet inhaled deeply at each presentation, his eyes half closed in contemplative repose. He placed the cakes upon a shallow lacquered tray, arranging them in a careful line, as if they were old friends awaiting familiar greetings. The scholar watched with tranquil patience, allowing the poet all the time he needed to learn their subtle languages. With practiced fingers, the poet began to untie the first bamboo ribbon. The slender band yielded cleanly, releasing the silk wrapper. He peeled back the cloth in gentle folds, as though unveiling a treasured scroll. The cake emerged, dark, matte, and still warm from the afternoon light. Its surface, embossed with the scholar's own seal, carried a faint sheen of natural oils and gelatinous binder. The poet ran the pad of his forefinger along the carved characters, noting how the strokes held the softest glimmer of gloss against the velvet-black surface. Each ridge and valley in the seal's pattern felt alive under his fingertip, like the fine striations of a distant mountain range caught in midnight shadow. He raised the cake to eye level, tilting it against the light that filtered through a latticed window. He examined the edge where the paste had met the mold's lip, smooth and continuous without trace of crack or flaw. Beneath the carved seal, the ink's body seemed dense, as though it might yield an unending ribbon of color at the stroke of a brush. The scholar, standing to one side, offered a quiet commentary. This piece was formed in the early hours, when the clay-like paste was still warm from kneading. The moisture settled evenly, and the glaze of glue has just the right smoothness for fine lines. The poet nodded thoughtfully, absorbing each word without haste. He placed that first piece back on the tray and turned to the next. The ritual repeated: untie, unwrap, inspect, inhale. At times he paused to close his eyes and breathe through his mouth, seeking the memory of the soot's origin, the pine knot struck at dawn in a forest of mist. Another cake bore the taste of afternoon's brightest sun. Its binder had been tempered longer, creating a firmer crust that the poet described in a low tone as, like the calligraphic stroke of an eagle's talon, sure and unwavering. Each description seemed weighed against some inner standard, some measure beyond words. After several long minutes, the poet's gaze settled on the third cake. He untied its ribbon with deliberate care and slowly unfolded its silk cocoon. This one felt different under his palm, neither too heavy nor too light, with a balance that hinted at harmony. His fingertips brushed the seal, a poetic couplet etched into the wood before casting, that read, "Ink born of quiet fires, song held in silent nights." He inhaled its muted fragrance, noting the subtle shade of green in its black, like oil upon water, and felt the coolness of the ink stone already echo in his mind. Lifting it to his shoulder, he turned to the scholar and inclined his head, a quiet declaration of choice. The scholar bowed in return, retrieving a small jade rod and trailing it across the chosen cake's edge. With that single movement, he affirmed the poet's selection. The cake yielded just enough under the rod's slight pressure, neither cracking nor resisting. The scholar then guided the poet toward the window ledge, where the inkstone lay ready. Lantern light was still hours away, for now, the gentle glow of late sun fell across polished black stone. The chosen cake rested upon the stone's shoulder, poised for the next chapter of its life. Beyond the courtyard door, the sky deepened to lavender as evening gathered its stars. Inside, the scholar arranged a small porcelain dish of spring water beside the inkstone. The poet, eyes never leaving the cake, reached for the slender wooden spatula that had first stirred binder and soot in this very room. He placed the cake's edge against the stone's well, preparing to awaken the ink's hidden depths. In the calm hush that settled over them, the tools of centuries past seemed to lean in, waiting. And thus, with deliberation slow and sure, the evening's artistry began to stir. The hush that followed the poet's departure echoed softly through the workshop's carved cedar panels. Lamps had not yet been lit, but the air carried the faint glow of fading daylight, enough to reveal the smooth silhouette of the inkstone resting at the center of the low scholar's table. After selecting the perfect cake, its surface engraved with graceful characters, its weight and scent telling of fine aging, the scholar paused at the threshold. A deliberate hush fell over the workshop as he closed the carved doors behind him, sealing out the last sounds of footsteps on the courtyard stones. In that brief instant, the world outside and the world within seemed to merge, held in the quiet space between intention and creation. This was the moment, he knew, when stone and water and ink cake would come together in a silent ceremony that awakened the scholar's art. He moved with careful slowness, his fingers brushing away a stray marble paperweight from the table so that the inkstone lay bare. The form of the stone was simple, an oval well carved just deep enough to hold a measured spoonful of water, a shallow expanse beyond for gentle grinding. Its surface, a dark, polished slate flecked with minute veins, caught the last of the light, revealing a surface as smooth as polished bone. He reached for the little porcelain cup at his side, its glaze a pale celadone hue, and drew it forward with a slight, deliberate tilt of his wrist. The cup held water drawn that morning from the jade-clear stream that carved its way through the conifer groves beyond the southern gate. Each drop promised purity, a guarantee that no stray mineral or hint of cloud would interfere with the ink's perfect formation. In his left hand, he held a slender bamboo spoon, its handle carved from the first shoots of spring bamboo, halved lengthwise and bound with a single tuft of silk cord. He had measured this utensil's shallow curve against the inkstone's well innumerable times, until its arc fit as precisely as a moon's reflection in still water. Tilting the porcelain cup, he allowed the water to pool gently against the spoon's hollow, then guided a single drop to the center of the stone's well. The drop trembled there, as if uncertain of its place, then settled into a flawless bead of glassy clarity. He paused to observe it, noting the way the surface tension held the droplet's shape until a stray strand of his scholar's sleeve brushed against the spoon, and it began its silent descent. With unhurried grace, he set the bamboo spoon aside and retrieved the ink cake. The chosen piece was small but dense, its edges worn slightly from earlier handling, its carved inscriptions deep and precise. Holding it like a talisman, he positioned its beveled end against the inkstone's groove, the triangle-shaped channel designed to cradle the paste as it yielded its pigment. He pressed lightly, and the stone answered with a whisper of resistance, a sensation that spoke of quality hide glue and soot refined to the finest particulate. At that instant, the workshop seemed to exhale, as though the inkstone itself welcomed the union of water and solid ink cake. Gently, the scholar rotated the cake edge against the slick of water, coaxing a thin ribbon of ink to unfurl from the stone's well. The sound was almost inaudible, yet in that stillness it rang clear, a soft rasp that spoke of centuries of practice and craftsmanship. He tilted the stone ever so slightly, allowing the new slip of ink to collect in a crescent pool. As the pool deepened, its color revealed itself, not a flat black, but a subtle gradation from deep charcoal at its heart to smoky gray at its fringe. In the dimming light, the freshly drawn lines glimmered like wet stones, and the scholar noted with satisfaction the ink's silky sheen. Turning then to his brushes, he reached for the slender tube of carved bamboo hanging from a nearby peg. Inside lay a wolf-hair brush, its tapering tip bound with a single ring of gold thread, the hairs immaculate and springy. He withdrew it reverently and inspected the ferrule, ensuring no stray fibers remained loose. Beside the brushes lay a flat box of fine chien paper, each sheet slightly translucent, with a surface that bore the faintest watermark of willow branches. He lifted the topmost sheet, its edges crisp, and placed it upon a wooden board slanted at a gentle angle. The paper absorbed stray light, glowing faintly like frost in dawn's early sun. He straightened the sheet, smoothing its corners with the back of his hand, mindful that even the slightest wrinkle could betray the hand that followed. For a moment, the scholar rested his brush upon the lip of the inkstone, dipping only its tip into the lustrous pool. The hairs fanned just enough to drink deep of the pigment, then retracted into a pointed tip. He held the brush against his breast, closing his eyes in silent reflection. In that pause, the sense of cedar and warmed pottery, of morning spring water and the faintly sweet trace of hide glue, mingled in the cool stillness. He breathed them in, feeling the weight of tradition settle gently within him, as though every scholar who had ever formed letters upon parchment watched in quiet approval. Slowly, he lifted the brush and withdrew his hand, mindful not to let the ink drip. He arranged his seat before the low table, plumping the rolled cushion of embroidered silk beneath him, and settled into the cross-legged posture he had known since youth. The tip of the brush hovered just above the awaiting paper. Here, in the muted half-light, the stage was set for the next chapter of creation, a ritual of motion and ink that would give life to thought, that would transform still intentions into living lines of verse. Stone, water, and ink cake had come together in this initial ceremony. The scholar's gaze remained fixed upon the glossy pool, now anticipating the gentle friction of grinding that would soon follow beneath paper lantern light. Within this quiet workshop, time itself seemed measured by the rhythms of scholar and inkstone, by the gradual darkening of daylight and the readiness of brush and paper. And so, with the well-prepared mixture awaiting its final coaxing, the scholar sat in serene expectation, ready to welcome the lantern's glow, to begin the slow, meditative dance that would carry the song of his pen across the silent night. Long into the night, when the courtyard was hushed save for the faint murmur of cicadas beyond the eaves, the scholar returned to his workshop beneath the soft flare of a paper lantern. Its square panels of mulberry paper glowed faintly gold, throwing warm pools of light over the low wooden table, the earthenware water dropper, and the inkstone that lay waiting like a silent actor before its final transformation. Outside, pale moonlight sifted through the lattice screens, but it was the lantern's steady radiance that bore witness to this delicate ritual, ushering the final stage of ink-making, the grinding of the ink cake into liquid form. He paused for a moment at the threshold, breathing in the lingering scent of burned pine soot and cedar polish. The brazier's embers had long since cooled, and the dust that settled on the floorboards was brushed aside with an invisible hand of habit. Everything in this chamber was arranged by intention, the rounded inkstone carved from prized dolomite, the slender ink stick pressed into its shallow well, a small porcelain dish filled with spring water, and the bamboo dropper poised alongside a folded sheet of silk for wiping stray drips. Here, in near silence, the scholar prepared to coax forth the lustrous black slurry that would give shape to midnight poetry. He lifted the lantern higher on its black lacquered stand, centering its glow over the inkstone. The soft rustle of his robe was the only sound as he settled onto the woven mat, his posture straight yet relaxed. With deliberate care, he retrieved the ink stick, its surface mottled with faint ridges and the faintest residue of earlier use. In the dim warmth of lantern light, the carved characters along its length, inscriptions of auspicious phrases and the maker's seal, seemed to come alive, half hidden in shadow. He offered a small bow to the ink cake, an unspoken gesture of respect for the centuries of artisans who had fashioned this vessel of thought. Then, ever so gently, he pressed the rounded end of the ink stick into the stone's shallow reservoir. A crescent moon of water, only a few drops at first, glistened around the perimeter. He kept his breath soft, measured, and with the slightest of adjustments he tilted the stick just enough to disperse moisture across its face. The weight of the stick and the density of the stone met in quiet resistance. Beginning at one side, he guided the ink stick in slow, circular strokes, the motion so regular and continuous that it mirrored the rhythm of his own heartbeat. In that dark chamber, time seemed suspended. Each rotation of the stick released a whisper of pigment, fine particles detaching and mingling with the clear liquid. The sound was imperceptible, only the faintest whisper, a brushing against stone, but to the trained ear it spoke volumes. Around him, the shadows leaned forward, drawn by that almost magical confluence of water and soot. With unwavering patience, he kept his hand moving, circle by circle, widening the ring, deepening the pool, coaxing out the darkness. After a dozen turns, he paused. A single droplet of water formed at the tip of the bamboo dropper, a hollow tube of polished reed with a gently flared mouthpiece. He lifted it to his lips for a moment, testing its readiness, then inclined it above the ink stone. Slowly, he squeezed the dropper, coaxing only 3 droplets to fall, each one plinking softly into the reservoir. The first dispersed at the center, the second struck the side of the pool, and the third carried just enough momentum to rim the edge. He waited, watching how the new water rippled the surface. Tiny concentric rings appeared, then flattened into the dark pool, as if the ink welcomed the fluid enhancement. He resumed grinding. Now, with the added moisture, more pigment loosened, coalescing into a deeper shade. Each pass of the ink stick felt richer, smoother. The friction warmed the stone ever so slightly, releasing a delicate aroma, a mingling of graphite and smoky pine that spoke of mountainside hearth fires. Under the lantern's blush, the ink's surface took on a soft sheen, like oil pooling on water. The scholar slowed his motions once more, savoring the sight of the swirling black turning a shade of jade black at the edges, as if the night sky itself had been condensed into a viscous pool. As he worked, his mind wandered through memories of colleagues who had once shared this ritual. He remembered the soft laughter of a friend at dawn, the sharp critique of a visiting poet, and the hush that fell when the first brushstroke of fresh ink met paper. Though alone tonight, he felt their presence in the flicker of the lantern flame and in the weight of the ink stick in his palm. This ceremony, too, was a conversation, between scholar and ink, between past and present, between thought and form. After several more minutes, the scholar tested the ink's consistency. He lifted the stick briefly, letting the slurry trickle back into the well. It moved with a measured liquidity, neither too watery nor too thick. He scraped a wisp of the ink onto the smooth surface of the stone and observed how it clung for an instant before melting back into the pool. Perfect. With final, patient circles, he released the remainder of pigment from the stick, pressing gently so that every last particle yielded its color. The ink stick grew lighter under his hand, the carved characters darkening with moisture, and finally, with a soft sigh that seemed to echo from the stone itself, the act of grinding was complete. He set the ink stick aside on its silk mat, wiping away excess moisture with delicate folds of cloth. The black slurry in the reservoir was now still, reflecting the lantern's glow like a polished gem. Leaning forward, the scholar inhaled that familiar, almost sacred scent, the scent of possibility. In that moment, all that had gone before, the gathering of soot, the cleansing waters, the simmering of glue, the shaping of cakes, culminated here in this simple pool of ink. It was the alchemy of centuries distilled into a single act, ready to bear witness to poetry in the darkest hours. He allowed himself a gentle smile, the corners of his eyes crinkling in contentment. Soon, the brush would follow, and the page would surrender its blankness to the dance of calligraphy. But before that, he lingered, savoring the quiet triumph of the grind. The candle at the corner of the table flickered, sending up tiny tongues of light that rippled across the ink's surface. And for a moment, the scholar felt as though he were peering into another world, a world where ink flows like memory, where lantern light kindles the imagination, and where the simplest act of grinding binds past to future in a rhythm as ancient as the mountains outside. Thus, beneath the gentle watch of a single lantern, the ink was born, jade black, lustrous, and deep. The scholar sat back, poised, ready at last to let the brush speak. In the hush of night, he would take that first stroke, and the workshop would fill with the soft music of poetry. But that, as the old masters taught, must wait for the next breath, the next beat of the heart, when the poem itself, carried on that black river of ink, would guide the scholar through midnight's silent corridors of thought. The scholar settles himself before the low wooden desk, its surface worn smooth by decades of steady use. Only the faint glow of a single beeswax candle breaks the midnight stillness. Around him, the rafters of the high ceiling and the earthen walls fade into shadows, as though the room itself were holding its breath, waiting for the first flourish of ink on rice paper. A flurry of memories crosses his mind. This very room, this same humble chamber, has borne witness to countless hours of poetry and reflection, yet tonight feels especially hushed, as if the world outside is drawn back to grant him unbroken silence. He lifts the slender brush from its porcelain rest. The handle, carved from pale bamboo, curves gently at the end, worn to a warm patina by the steady grasp of diligent fingers. Its bristles, bound and trimmed with care, fan out in a fine chisel tip, each hair springing back obediently after a gentle squeeze. He inhales the faint scent of smoked pine and aged lacquer, a fragrance that mingles with the lingering aroma of the night's last brazier. With measured precision, he tilts the ink well, a shallow dish of polished stone, to capture a swirl of the raven-black liquid. A single drop clings to the edge, gleaming like a memory of moonlight caught in shadow. Brushing the ink against the inner curve of the well, he lifts the brush tip until the bristles carry just enough moisture to darken but not drench the paper. There is a moment of stillness here, only his steady breath and the faint shifting of the candle flame, which flickers as though stirred by an unseen breeze. Then, with confidence born of long practice, he draws the first stroke across the pristine sheet of rice paper. The brush glides, carrying the ink in a silky ribbon that settles into the paper's soft fibers. A solitary horizontal line, crisp and even, yet bearing the slightest trace of wavering, an honest testament to the living hand that guides it. He pauses. The wet ink glistens where the candlelight strikes it, forming tiny pools at the edges of each character. The glow paints the strokes in deep jade-black hues that shift as he moves, transforming each mark into its own small universe of form and shadow. The scholar's eyes narrow with quiet satisfaction. There is something almost holy in this communion of brush, ink, and paper, a fleeting moment in which time seems to stand still, and the eternal rhythm of creation flows through human hands. Then he breathes out, and his mind turns inwards. The first couplet forms in his thoughts, an image of winter pines outside his study window, their branches etched against the sky like black ink on white silk, a memory of dawn, when the world was washed in pale light. He lifts the brush once more, fingertips steady, and inscribes the adaptation of his vision. Each character emerges slowly from the tip of the brush, strokes interlocking with thoughtful precision. As he writes, the candle's flame flares softly, sending shifting patterns of light across the page. He almost believes he sees the trees themselves swaying in the half-light beyond the walls. Between couplets, he sets the brush aside and leans back, closing his eyes to summon the next image. In the hush of the workshop, he can almost hear the distant murmur of the courtyard, an owl calling from the eaves, the rustle of bamboo leaves brushing the night breeze. These sounds feed the current of thought that flows through him, shaping lines of verse before they touch paper. When he feels the shape of the next phrase, he crackles his neck, flexes his shoulders, and lifts the brush again. The second couplet rises more swiftly, confident in its rhythm. He accentuates each diagonal stroke with intent, drawing the ink in long, decisive curves. The brush meets the paper with a whisper, then glides away, leaving a trail as delicate as a dream. The scholar watches the fresh ink settle, noting how the soak of liquid into fiber deepens each stroke's hue. A bead of wax from the candle drips onto the desk, a molten pebble that he deliberately resists flicking away, for in this moment of concentrated creation, even an errant drop feels intrusive. Yet he allows himself a faint smile, recalling the journeys that brought him here, the mountains at dawn, gathering pine soot by the light of dawn stars, the slow days in the workshop, purifying and blending, stirring the ink paste until it became a silent poem of its own. All that labor, all those ritual gestures, they have led to this solitary communion of brush and thought. He leans in closer to the paper. The candle's flame hangs low, shielded from drafts by a folded sheet of oiled paper. Its glow forms a gentle pool of light just large enough to illuminate his work. Outside, the courtyard is draped in darkness. Within, the amber warmth encloses him in a world of edges softened by lamplight. He can see his own breath rise and fall, a quiet rhythm that matches the beating of his heart. In the hush, he notes the texture of the rice paper, its slight grain beneath the brush tip, how it soaks in the ink and then smooths again, like water returning to glass. He dips the brush once more, less for ink than for continuity, threading a final line that binds his verse together. The words speak of impermanence, of how the candle's light will dwindle, how the inked paper must someday fade, and yet how each moment of expression endures beyond the life of its maker. In these thoughts, he finds solace. Though the flame may die, the poem lives on. With the last stroke complete, he sets the brush down gently. The page before him holds 4 lines of verse, each character hovering between form and meaning, quiet and insistent. He studies the shapes with a scholar's critical eye, noting the weight of each horizontal bar, the curvature of each dot. A fine bead of ink has pooled at the terminus of the final radical. He resists the urge to blot it away, letting it stand as proof of the living moment it marks. Silence returns, pulsing with the final flicker of the candle. He rises slowly, stepping back to let the poem breathe under the shifting lamplight. For a long moment he lingers, allowing his senses to drink in the scent of ink and wax, the soft echo of his breathing, the faint creak of timber settling in the cool night. Then, with deliberate care, he closes his eyes and bows his head, an act of gratitude, to the night, to the calligraphy tools that have spoken through his hand, to the unseen audience of moon and stars. The scholar returns to his desk and pours a little water onto the inkstone surface. He dips the brush slowly, cleansing the bristles of their burden, then rinses it again until the water runs clear. Each stroke of the brush against the stone echoes in the silence, a final echo of creation before closure. He stands the brush upright in its rest, lays the carved wooden cap over its tip, and gently rolls up the finished poem with tender hands, placing it into a waiting silk folder. As he gathers his tools, the candle burner's flame lowers to the wick, flickers once, and then steadies. The scholar watches the steady glow for a while, as if gleaning from it the wisdom of many nights past. He cannot know how many more evenings will find him here, brush in hand, seeking the perfect line. But tonight, in the hush of midnight, he has given form to thought, leaving behind a testament in black ink that will outlast both candlelight and him. With the poem tucked safely away, he extinguishes the flame. A soft sigh passes through the room as the darkness returns, its velvet depth broken only by the faint reflection of moonlight on the stone floor. The scholar steps back, pulls the door's wooden latch, and closes the workshop behind him. Beyond it, the silent halls await the dawn and the promise of a new day's labor. Yet for this night, his verses remain, a quiet offering to the world, composed beneath lantern light, resonant in its stillness, ready to greet the morning. The scholar sat for a moment longer at his low table, letting the final couplet of verse linger in the air. The lantern's soft glow cast tremulous shapes upon the paper, and the ink still shimmered where the brush had just lifted. Outside, the night was still as a held breath, only the distant drip of dew from a sheltering roof tile and the faint rustle of bamboo reeds in the courtyard offered the merest reminders that the world beyond these carved doors continued its slow turning. He pressed down on the fine rice paper, feeling through the fibers the cool smoothness of each stroke he had laid. A careful hand swept the surface of the writing table, collecting the stray fragments of paper from previous trials, erasures, doodled characters, tiny flakes of residue. Then he reached for the inkstone, that polished slab of dark jade bearing the faint marks of 100 midnight labors. With his silk-wrapped fingers, he lifted a soft white cloth, dipped it in the porcelain basin of clear water at his side, and began the ritual of cleansing. The basin held the day's last wash water, a shallow pool strewn with traces of soot. As the cloth moistened, the scholar drew it across the inkstone, guiding it in small spiraling motions. Black streaks emerged at first, concentric swirls of pigment that thickened and curled into subtle arcs. He welcomed these final traces, for they carried the memory of every poem ground beneath the lantern's flame. Each swirl, each thin arc of sludge, represented a moment of thought, a flourish of the brush. Slowly, with infinitely measured care, he wiped until the stone lay pale and dry, a blank mirror waiting to be called into service once more. Nearby, the porcelain basin, now emptied of its inky residue, stood ready to receive the brushes. The scholar lifted his bamboo-handled brushes, each one still bearing the damp embrace of the night's work. He held them one by one under the gentle stream of water, coaxing out the jets of black that clung stubbornly to the bristles. The longer brush, its shaft scented faintly of sandalwood, yielded first, black droplets spiraling down into the basin. Then the shorter brush, used for fine lines and seals, released its burden with a soft sigh of bristles. He rinsed each until the water ran clear, until the bristles sighed no more with hidden darkness. With the brushes cleansed, he set them upon a carved wooden stand, bristle side up, as tradition dictated. The stand itself was an heirloom, a rectangular block of dark camphor wood with small grooves carved at precise intervals. Each groove held a brush in splendid alignment, as though they were scholars cued for examination. Upright, they fanned outward like a miniature grove of bamboo, their white tips drying toward the lantern's modest warmth. The scholar stepped back, nodded in satisfaction, and closed his eyes briefly to commit the sight to memory. Now all that remained was the brazier, its embers reduced to glowing coals. He bent down and lifted the iron lid by its small handle, inhaling the faint scent of charred pine. Carefully, with ritual calm, he laid a small scrap of rice paper over the coals, suffocating the last spark. A small wisp of smoke curled upward and vanished. He replaced the cover, closing the chamber, then slid a leather strap over the lid to ensure that no stray spark could escape. The workshop stood cool as marble. The scholar rose and moved toward the great doors of carved cypress. His sandals made no sound on the polished stone floor. He pressed his palms to the lintel, felt the grain of the wood beneath his fingertips. In one continuous motion, he lifted the heavy bar and slid it into its bracket. The doors swung inward on bronze hinges, revealing a dark corridor beyond. He extinguished the lantern at its post, plunging the threshold into gentle shadow, and engaged the latch with a soft click. Outside, the courtyard lay bathed in moonlight, the trays of drying ink cakes now still ghosts beneath silken screens. A slender beam of lunar light fell across the threshold and into the workshop, illuminating at once the polished stone floor and the neat row of tool racks along the wall. The scholar paused to breathe in that pale radiance. The air was saturated with hushed fragrances, the lingering aroma of rice wine from an earlier offering beside the inkstone, the faint sweetness of the sandalwood brush handles, the cool scent of the season's first chrysanthemums, nestled in a bronze vase near the entrance. All these subtleties he carried with him as he stepped into the corridor. Behind him, the doors closed and the bronze latch clicked twice. The echo of that final click seemed to seal the night itself. The scholar took up a small lantern, its paper sides etched with the image of plum blossoms, and lit its wick with a single spark. Its glow bathed the corridor in soft yellow luminescence. He moved with measured steps toward his quarters, pausing at the threshold to glance back at the closed workshop. Silently, he offered a word of gratitude to the tools and materials, the inkstone that had held the world of thought, the brushes that had woven characters of longing and wonder, the brazier that had warmed the clay pot and tempered the binder. In that silent communion, he sealed another night's labor within the walls of his atelier. In his room, he placed the lantern on a low stool and stretched a fine silk mat upon the floor. He unrolled the scroll of his final poem and read it once more, lips whispering each character. The verses spoke of moonlight on pine boughs, of the hush that follows the last drop of ink, of the restless heart that finds solace in measured lines. As he read, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, taking on shapes of words dancing in the night air. Content, he rolled the scroll back into its silk wrapper, tied it with a thin ribbon of pale blue, and laid it beside his pillow. He drew the cotton coverlet close around his shoulders, feeling the lingering warmth from the lantern's glow. The world beyond the paper walls appeared distant and dreamlike, the soft patter of dew on the wooden eaves, the faint croon of an owl in the pines, the whisper of wind coursing through bamboo canes. All was hushed. In that gentle stillness, the scholar's mind began to clear, each thought settling like soot in a basin of water. Before sleep claimed him fully, he let his mind wander briefly to the dawn to come. A new day would bring the dawn's first rosy light, and with it, a return to the forest's muted shadows to collect fresh pine soot. He might lift the wooden latch of the workshop doors and sweep away the dust of 100 nights' dreams. He might sort through the particles of charcoal, discarding what was coarse, preserving what was pure. He might again listen to the faint hiss of glue simmering over a low flame, the swirl of binder and pigment uniting in an ancient dance. But these tasks belonged to a future hour, still held fast in the unbroken hush of the present night. He closed his eyes, and the last image in his mind was the folded brushes, bristles still faintly damp, standing guard like silent sentinels beside the polished stone slab. The moon's pale glow filtered through a narrow window above, resting in a slender band across the floor. In that sliver of light, the scholar found his final thought before sleep: tomorrow's work would begin anew, but for now, the stillness was enough. The air inside the chamber felt as solid as ink itself, pure, undisturbed, awaiting the caress of dawn's whispering winds. And with that, he drifted into dreams, clasped in the gentle silence of a night's final closure.